great. So today also happens to be every other Wednesday for our professional members at GYA. So those that are basically in at the $100 or higher level in a membership. So if you're a high school counselor, you probably wouldn't qualify. If you're a program provider or an IEGYC, an independent educational gap year consultant, or an accredited gap year consultant, every other Wednesday, we have these it's like an hour to an hour and a half, just sort of professional group. Usually we seem to get around, I don't know, between 15 and I think the most it's ever been was like 60 people, but we're averaging around 15 or 20 these days. And it's just kind of a great sort of heads up. And last night I realized that they're both on my Zoom account. And so did some Kung Fu with the Zoom account guys to free it all up so that they could both run simultaneously. Who knew Zoom would be such a thing? I wish I had known and invested in Zoom a long time ago. But well, quick check-in with everyone. Today's going to be a kind of a sort of a slow but methodical pace today. We're going to get through a couple sort of bigger questions, and then really kind of want to open the door with the insurance and the legal folks this afternoon. Fred C. Church, Sam Daume, and Doug Stevens from Caplan, Earnest, LLC. They're sort of well known for doing this kind of work. And there's a lot of sort of devils in the details for those kinds of things in particular. So Roisin, like, I don't know how helpful it is to you to have the insurance legal conversation, or if that sort of feels like you got that covered from your programmatic basis at this point. But if you have questions that you have prepared, certainly that's what they're there for, to ask. And then to Andrea, Debbie, and then anyone else who pops in on the consultant side, it's going to be the same kind of thing. So just to start us off, give me a sense, what sort of, any sort of ahas or sort of catalytic moments from yesterday when you were just kind of like, I'm like, that actually sort of clarified a bunch of things for me. Andrea, I don't know if you've had time to go after and sort of rewatch the content from yesterday. I doubt you have, but any ahas from anyone yesterday?
I think going through the standards to me was really helpful to see why they came about, and kind of it makes a lot more sense in my mind, the breakdown. And I think that was a bit of an aha moment. And I think some of those pieces that I didn't fully understand came to light. So I learned a lot. Very helpful.
Good.
Yeah, I mean, I love that the standards exist, because it just really gives, such a good feeling as a parent, or just bringing, the whole organization to a really like professional standard. And it's just, it's great that it exists.
Good.
So that's really helpful.
Good.
Yeah, I think for me, I felt really kind of excited, like being new and having not had a gap year group yet. I think that our instinct to shape our program around the standards from the get-go, I felt like that was really confirmed, I was like, yep, we're definitely on the right track with this. This is really going to help us going into that first group. So
good. Happy to hear.
Excited.
Good. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think the standards when they first got developed, there was sort of this wondering of like, A, like who the hell am I to make some standards, right? B, right? Like gosh, we really need these. And C, what else is out there? And what I struggled with on the C of what else was out there, most other organizations that have their standards, either they're like so diluted as to be like you shall, and then they sort of offer you this totally nebulous sentence, and you're like, you could kind of aim at that in the dark and still 90% of the chance you'd hit that. I don't really know that that's actually helping anyone. But if they go like too far into the weeds, then you totally lose track of sort of, it's like, it's outside of our role of things to do, right? So it's been kind of an interesting process, and especially to see these sort of, out in the public. Ours are free and they're publicly available. Most others that are out there, not most, but a decent number, they'll charge for them. And I think that that's fine. It's a good way to make some revenue. But I think it also diminishes the value of the standards and the work that they sort of mean to the public. So when you are you know, like Andrea, when you're sort of going through Barrage and sort of putting this all together, and you can put that sort of either you're accredited or these were built on the back of GYA standards, like to a family, they've never heard of, you know, Barrage or gap years or any of this kind of stuff. Like they just need anything to like hold on to, those extra little bits of credibility. They really do count. Great. Jane, if you're there, I just was asking any ahas, any sort of catalyzing moments from yesterday.
Hi. Yeah. I think, like has been said, I felt like it's really helpful to, you know, affirming to build the practice around the standards, and then also just giving more reality. It was good hearing the program stuff, more reality to what it's really like, and some of the risks, the real risks that are there.
Yeah.
Why
Yeah.
it's important.
That's great. That's great. Do you want to hear a story? So yesterday I got a call from a member program that was dealing with its first student departure and struggling with, right, like what's the right order of operations? You know, the things that the student said, the behavior, like, is it that out of bounds? Is it a spectrum student? And you just really have to, because this has happened multiple times in the gap year space, we love to do the soft touchy-feely thing where we'll give you the advice from the side, and then maybe we'll give you it from the other side. But if you've got a spectrum kiddo, sometimes they like, I can't hear it any other way than just head on. And you have to just give it head on. And in fact, I also have to caution that sort of the clock to get a student out can't start until that direct head on conversations also takes place. It's really one of the common mistakes from a lot of program side is to try and, you know, again, come around the edges, right? Do the soft touch. It's the Portland sort of like, it's totally a Northwest, like passive aggressive thing. I find it somewhat incredibly annoying at times. And at other times it's kind of like, oh, thank you. I appreciate sort of the care that's from there. And for some students in this case, this particular student just can't hear anything unless it's this. And so the question then becomes sort of like what kinds of admissions protocol should the program have considered differently? Should they have interviewed the referral source somehow differently? Do they need to tighten their EEC? And then as this was their first sort of process to kick a student out of program, they had made the mistake of having all of these conversations with the student, right? And that makes sense, right? You're going to have a conversation with a student, but it doesn't start until there's a written document that's sort of created, and then you can start to build the processes and pathways out. And so the question that this organization was struggling with was how do I communicate to the parent? How do I communicate to the student? How do I communicate to the rest of the cohort? So one of the things that we sort of spent a fair bit of time talking through was if the rest of the cohort has this one student who's just all of a sudden gone, right? Like from their perspective, yeah, I was struggling, but then all of a sudden the student's gone. That's incredibly destabilizing for two reasons to the rest of the cohort. One is, hey, I'm invested in this student's outcome. I'm invested in all of my students, my peers' outcomes. And so if you don't give me the opportunity to interject or sort of support this student, then I'm failing this student, and I feel like others are going to fail me, right? And then sort of the spiral begins. The other part of the equation that comes up is from the rest of the students' perspective, they know that there's been some sort of grist going on. But if all of a sudden the student is gone, from their perspective, they're like, gosh, like I didn't seem that bad, but now all of a sudden he's gone. Maybe I'm doing something that not that bad, but all of a sudden I could be gone. And so again, the spiral begins, you know, and it sort of doubles down because those two together. So you really have to think about, right? Like not only what's in the student's best interest, and I'll be honest, sometimes sending a student home is in their own best interest. And I think that that's one of the things that oftentimes gets forgotten about is sometimes a student might not learn the lesson until they actually get the hard consequence. And that's partially what being a good educator is. In this particular case, walked through a way to do some restorative justice. So working with the student to build a contract. It's not just here's the contract, but it's here's the specific behaviors we want to address. Here's what it's looked like so far. Here's where the complaints are, and then go back to the group with the student, and the student can own their own narrative. Oftentimes this takes place where they're telling the rest of the cohort, hey team, I've struggled in these ways. I need your support in these ways. It's not a hat in hand. It's not a mea culpa, not necessarily. Sometimes it is. Rather, it's I need your support. I want to stay. This is good for me. Hopefully you enjoy having me here. I want your support. So that's one thing that's going to take place. Another thing that's going to take place is, I think, like, think about this. So what's the best order of operations to connect with the parent in these circumstances, right? Because you can't just like HIPAA and FERPA, you can't just say, okay, parents sort of like students going to go, and I'm not going to tell the parents at all. And then it's up to the student when they're sort of getting booted to call mom and dad and be like, I have to change my flight. The world doesn't work that way. So HIPAA and FERPA, yes, but at some level there has to be some logistics coordination. There's like, parents are going to ask, like, is my kid safe? Are they okay? They're going to ask about refunds and finances and those kinds of things. And so you got to think through all of those little details as they come up. Quick thought experiment to everybody on the call. So let's imagine you have to tell the parents. You have a student who's leaving, and I'm just concerned about the student-parent dynamic right now, sort of those two key stakeholders. What are some things and considerations you might make? Sort of what's either an action you might do, or sort of consideration for some of the actions that you might be coming with. And Jane, you had your hand up earlier. If you, sorry, you're muted.
Two things that I've been thinking about related to that, because I like the SOAP notes structure, but as I was thinking about it in relation to the conversation with the parents, I feel like there needs to be an integrated bottom line up front, because you can't just say, these are the subjective things, these are the, objective things in your process. You have to, I feel like you need your opening sentence needs to have the interpretation of the events that you want to convey, because you just want to, that's just, I feel like that's important. And then the other thing I've been thinking about that I would want to consider is sort of just the timing of communication as crises unfold, because often initial information is not reliable. So you're balancing the speed, you want to get the, have the initial conversations as quickly as possible, but that as you get more information, things may change. And so you don't want to, I don't know, just thinking, those are some of the things I'd consider.
Yeah, those are good. Those are really, really good. Especially, I'm thinking, I'm glad you threw in the timing of events, because you're right, these things can go very fast. There's a desire for them to go fast, because being in limbo is really hard for all parties involved. And what are your responsibilities, sort of to truth, right? But also, what are your responsibilities to having a swift resolution? Because again, the limbo piece.
And the student controls their narrative, but they don't control the narrative for everyone, So I feel that as the program or the counselor, whoever's communicating to parents, you owe it to them to provide your interpretation. And you may want to preface that this is my preliminary interpretation, but, some sort of bottom line.
Good. I like it. Good thoughts, Jane. Anyone else have any other thoughts on how they might approach that conversation with those two stakeholders? Debbie?
I mean, it's not necessarily about, I sort of have an aha thing that I wanted to share. So, as an independent college counselor for, over 20 years, I feel like the difference in doing this kind of work is that when students go away to college, it's sort of like you're kind of done with them, right? Like, we don't follow them to college. And I mean, we sometimes the parents will send a picture like he's doing great, or we'll hear like, oh, they want to transfer, but we're not so involved in the, once they go, we're just involved in the process. That's the work.
Right.
And this seems like there's a lot of that the gap year counselor really sees connected and very involved with the outcomes and while they're there, which I think is actually amazing. But that's kind of where my aha, I know I'm answering the last question.
You're fine.
But that's really interesting to me. So this is really making me just think about things in a, very different kind of way. And yeah, it's really interesting. So I'm kind of taking it all in, to be honest.
No, that's great, Debbie. That's great. And I think you're not wrong. Sort of the consultants at the gap year level, I feel like it's you're intimately connected to what's happening for the student while they're out on program. Like generally, I would say it's considered a best practice. And Roisin and Andrea, feel free to sort of disabuse me of this if this is no longer true. But I feel like it's considered a best practice is if you have a consultant who's working with one of your students, you include the consultant in the majority of the conversations and the communications. Not all of them. They don't need to know all of the specific details. But generally speaking, right, like it's clear what your job is with the students, to support them to grow, develop, pluck a future that feels purpose oriented, all these great things. You have to know just sort of where they're struggling, where they're totally succeeding, where they're finding new capacities and sort of like blowing the ceiling off, yeah, let's put more energy into that and less into the places where they're struggling. On one front, it's kind of like so there's two different approaches to the consulting work, I think. One is to say more the old school, which is to sort of say like the magic happens once they're out. They'll figure it out. If I figure it out too much for them, then I'm robbing them of the magic. So get them out and then be there as a soft landing when they come back. The other is get them out, and I know just historically week 2 to 4 there's going to be some struggly points. Typically around week 6 to 8, there's going to be a different type of struggle that's coming up, and then preparing them to come back, that's a third type of struggle. So I'm going to sort of, load some materials, some conversations, get them things scheduled just to preempt the hard parts. I think like everything experiential, right? You don't want to sort of rob them of the harder edges, because that's where the learning oftentimes happens. But it is up to us to make sure that those lessons, those harder edges are translated into something that they can do something with, something meaningful. And so a lot of times, I don't know if you've been out there and been homesick, in that moment when it all sort of comes rolling on your shoulders, the homesickness, you can't hear any good advice. You just need to be in homesick mode and the discomfort of that. And no amount of words will change that. But once they've seen themselves through, a night or two of bad sleep, and they're like, they just sort of see the world differently. That's when, if they have the resources there, if they have a staff person who's next to them to just hold space, a lot can open up. I had a student group, and I still want to stay on the subject here. I had a student group in India. We were doing a 2-week yoga retreat. About a week into the yoga retreat, the students were just they were like, I'm good. I've gotten my fill of yoga. And you're like, okay, what's going on? And they're like, it's really uncomfortable being in such a tight space. Like all of the stuff you would expect of like being in a spiritual environment for a young person, they're like hitting the walls, right? And so we do the bargaining thing, the negotiating thing, right? So 2 weeks, all right, we can leave 4 days early. But we have to do these 3 things, and we have to exit sort of in integrity. Great. In the back of my head, as an instructor, I'm thinking like, oh, there's some really good lessons here. And so those last 3 days of that second week, right, when they're just powering through, and all they can see is the departure, when they can get access to the good food and the chai and the fatty things, and just not something that's in an ashram environment. It's not until we're on the road leaving the ashram that the door really opened to a larger conversation. So what was that eject? Why did you have to hit the eject button from that ashram so hard, right? Was it just the yoga? Maybe there was a couple other things. And then on the drive through the mountains in the Himalayas going back into town, we had 3 to 4 hours of some of the most sort of like just jaw-droppingly profound conversation, but it couldn't have happened while we were in the ashram. It had to happen in the rear view, literally in this case, of actually being out. And so I think a lot of like when you're in an experiential environment, sort of you have to, like, in some ways I was thinking about sort of the timing of it all, right? That is something that you have to be aware of, because the timing of sort of when you want to say the thing versus when they're able to hear the thing versus when the stakeholders need to hear the thing, they might be at odds with each other. And that's our job as the consultant or the program. They're coming to us as the knowledgeable parties to know it. So back to the Jane.
So I just am thinking about this as different from, because what you're going for is a transformational experience, as opposed to like, I had, if you're preparing an online course, your goal, you want the kids to complete the course.
Right.
And so you anticipate that, oh, there's going to be a natural dip around week 2. So we're going to make sure they have some quick wins so that they don't experience that dip too hard, and then it kind of smooths out the ups and downs.
Yeah.
But the thing is, no, let them go down, because that's when they're going to have more of a powerful experience. Is that right?
This is the hard part of experiential education, is they're both right. It depends on the student. So one of the things that I always like to try and do when I'm building a program, week 1 and week 2, students have an expectation of a reality that they're going to confront. And if you don't hit them with that expectation, then they go on autopilot pretty quick. So if you want to take them to Costa Rica and they're thinking, I'm going to go live in the developed world, but the first 2 weeks that they have are a language school with a nice homestay. So they're in a classroom environment, doing the classroom thing, getting filled up like an empty vehicle vessel, just like they've been their entire academic life. They go into autopilot and shut down really quick. But if you can take sort of the students and put them into a homestay environment, and this is where the variance is per student, is you might have 2 students in one homestay environment that's a nicer homestay, and 1 student who's a little bit more intrepid, who's in a further, more remote homestay. So they each have an experience that they can come back and share. But if you send that student off to the homestay and they're ill prepared, I guess. I don't know, totally lost my train of thought there.
Crash. It's like you want to stay within the zone.
Yes,
right?
yes, exactly. Yeah, exactly. That sort of, like we talked about the Counselors Institute a little bit, there's like the learning zone, the comfort zone, and the panic zone. And comfort zone is no learning's happening there. Learning zone, it's a sweet spot. For some students, it's pretty wide. For other students, it's pretty narrow. And then panic zone is like, nothing new is getting in. I'm fight or flight. This is all overwhelming. And so in those first 2 weeks of a homestay environment, is if you can put them into a homestay environment where they are all sort of like drowning, right? Just barely staying afloat. So that they're what's happening is the peer dynamics are coming together, their expectations are being met, and they're understanding the importance of learning the language as the next step. And so sort of, yes, it's a dip, but it's a very intentional dip. The dip creates hardship to awareness so that they can engage much more for the next stage or chapter of the journey.
Yeah, that's a good example.
Yeah. So back to the question, the 2 stakeholders here, the parent and the student, how might you navigate sort of like next steps with them, understanding that likely the student is going to go home, but you have to go through some mechanics beforehand, right? You want to make sure, Roisin?
I think the documentation is important. Also finding whoever the staff member who the student connects best with is
Nice.
helpful. I also think that if you're setting yourself up in your program with feedback, you've hopefully had honest enough feedback in a way where the student has had time to process. So it depends on the behavioral situation. It's not as much of a shock to them, or you can refer to things that have happened before. And I think that's where the HIPAA and the FERPA get tricky, because, and with younger students, then you need to call the parents. With this, I think as much honest communication with the students as possible, because their relationship with their parents. So some of them are totally understanding, others maybe don't want to talk to their parents at all and don't have a great relationship. So I think it's navigating that in a way where the students don't feel like you're, okay, well, we haven't called your parents and this is what we said. So I think having a conversation, and depending on the student, figuring out the best way, depending on the behavioral situation too, whether the student is there when you're on the phone with the parent, or at least you talk to them and say you're about to have that conversation. And I think it just is totally dependent on the behavior and on the relationship with the parents and students, but making sure that the students still feel that they are heard, and that you're not just kind of, because they are adults and you don't want them to feel that you're calling their parents and they're going to get them picked up, but understanding like why you need to do that piece.
So 2 great points here. One is I love that you identify, sort of find the staff person that the student most connects with. An interesting point is sometimes that might not be a staff person. Sometimes that might be another student who just happens to be sort of more mature, or, you know, every now and then sort of just a natural leader, sort of, you know, rises from the community, and that's a good person that you can sort of enroll in supporting the student for whatever their next steps are. Question for HIPAA and FERPA. Is it a 17-year-old, 18-year-old, 19-year-old thing? Like, when does it legally start? This might be a good question to ask our attorney this afternoon. My understanding with FERPA and HIPAA is, so most gap year providers are not technically required to abide by HIPAA or FERPA, unless, like, the full details of FERPA and HIPAA, unless that's written into the contract with a higher ed institution. That would be something that you would have specifically written into a contract. In most cases, these aren't things that a university wants you to sort of have a hand in, just because it's just too complicated already. Let's not sort of, you know, we'll do our thing at the university, you do your thing. In reality, in a university environment, though, HIPAA and FERPA, they apply if a student is 17. And they're enrolled at the university. The same concept is that the student should have their own experience, the freedom to make their own mistakes and have their own experience. And so it's an interesting question. Okay, so let's think about this, right? You have to have the logistics conversation with the parent around sort of flights home. You have to deal with sort of any financial conversations, sort of, right? Like, students leaving early, is there a refund that I'm getting, right? Mom and dad are going to be probably a little upset, because now they have to figure out next steps, those kinds of things. The students having a sense of failure, right? A crisis of conscience, right? Like, I failed at this, and that makes me bad. And so what can you do to support? So keep going. We've actually got a couple really great sort of threads that are going here, and there's a couple more that need to get fleshed out. Yeah, Andrea.
Yeah, I think, you know, one thing I think is worth mentioning, you know, with our organization, that when we do training around, and I'm assuming that you're talking about a scenario of the kind of more nebulous, like, this student is not a good fit for our program, not the obvious, they broke a rule and they're going home. I'm assuming
sort of, yeah, saying sort of like, some challenging things. You might even put it,
because they broke a rule is a different kind of conversation, right? Yeah. So, but we do some training around not to take anything for granted, and not to think that, not to be afraid of the small details or really stating or overstating the obvious in those situations. For example, you know, having all of the stakeholders in on every conversation, including what Rasheen said, you know, the staff member that might have the strongest connection with the student, the director and the parent and the student, whether that's a conference call or conference Zoom situation, because it's very easy to go down the rabbit hole of trying to translate what, you know, end up talking to a parent saying, well, your child said this, and then the child is saying something else to the parent. And then you're hearing, you know, a lot of stories get going, you know, from a lot of different people. So that may seem obvious to have all the stakeholders there, but sometimes in the moment, it's those little details that get lost by the wayside, if that makes sense. Yeah. And just obvious things like, you know, not getting into any kind of blame game or fault, like, as you say, having a lot of sensitivity around the student feeling that sense of failure, that, you know, we're all trying to do what's best for the student. We're all invested in their best interest. And that's ultimately why this is happening. You know what I mean? Is ultimately in their best interest, and to not lose sight of any of those small details.
Right. No, I like that. You know, just the constancy of reminder, right? Why are we doing this, right? It's not to enforce the rule. If your answer is the rule is the rule is the rule, then we've all failed. And then also to emphasize that sort of bringing in all of the stakeholders. I think those are great considerations, spot on. Some complexity when it comes to the FERPA HIPAA conversation in bringing in all the stakeholders, but that's not to say that you have to do it all at once. It could happen in stages. So that FERPA and HIPAA are sort of well considered. Here's sort of a couple of things that I would like to also throw into the milieu here. I love that word, milieu. Is oftentimes I find it's best is first thing is you have to communicate sort of as much as possible to the rest of the cohort, the rest of the students, for those two reasons we laid out earlier. But when doing so, you can't control that narrative. You have to let the student who's at the center of it control that narrative and ask for the support that they want. And there might be a learning sort of lesson there too, that they ask for the wrong thing, right? I ask for help with one thing, but really I'm too ashamed to ask for the help that I really need. And in some ways, it's like that's a tough point. Depending on the student, you might guide them a little bit more to ask for the thing they really need. And other times you might sort of say, listen, you're just an obstinate person right now, and that's the lesson you need to learn. And so that's what we're going to lean to. And it's not, I don't get any joy out of it. Certainly it's just, this is the lesson that you need to learn because you're telling me that. So I'm just going to keep my eyes open on it. My next stage that I usually like to do is to encourage the student to have a conversation with the parent. So the student calls the parent and we say, I'm not going to be there. It's a safe environment. There's no adults that are part of the program. You're just there to tell your story and ask for support. But then what I'm going to do is I'm going to follow up with the parent. And I'm going to call the parent and say, hey, like you just had a conversation with your student. I want to know, what did they tell you? Because there's inevitably some opportunity to correct some partial truths or just full on untruths, right? B, it gives me an opportunity to check in with the parents in a way that's FERPA and HIPAA considered, right? The students already shared the information. So now I'm coming in after the fact, the information's already out there. And I'm not going to sort of volunteer anything new. I'm going to wait for the parents to say stuff, but then I'm going to do my best to disabuse the parents of whatever the story is that the student told that's not fully true. What that also does is it tells me where the student's most struggling to hear sort of reality right now. And that gives me an additional coaching opportunity with my staff to follow up directly with the student in sort of wherever those coaching mechanisms are. And then once that conversation is done, then I'm starting a written record trail with mom and dad around, if this happened and these things don't change, then we need to start looking at logistics. So flights, here's the timelines for flights. Now, if the student does go home at the end of the program, I think it's really important to recognize and mark that you have a cohort that's a different cohort. So that means circling the wagons with your current or sort of remaining cohort and saying, hey, we are different. Let's honor what we were. Let's acknowledge who we are. And let's be conscious about moving forward. There's another stage that you have to do, and that's following up with the student who you did send home. It's really easy to send the student home as a quote unquote failure, but that's not our jobs. Our jobs are student success. And so not in the sort of gratuitous trophy for every action success. I mean, like there's success for everybody if it just needs some coaching. And so following up with the student to do two things. One is just to check in, to show that it wasn't transactional, to show that breaking the rule doesn't define them, and that sort of there's additional lessons and growth ahead. And two, ideally, is because you've done some research and either have next steps for another placement, a better fitting one. Here's a list of 10 organizations that I think might be a good fit for you, or instead, let's volunteer to work with your gap year consultant to figure out a next step. And if that's a clinical next step, if that's a different program next step, like, I don't really care. I just want what's best for your kiddo. And then from a programmatic perspective, I think it's always a hard case to make to say, we're going to keep all of your money, even though the student's sort of been a lot of a pain in the butt. That's not a case you can make easily to parents. And so the finances become a bit of a challenge in terms of a refund. I'm curious, Andrea or Roisin, do you guys have like a clear sort of refund policy in that kind of scenario, like that you just, it just worked really well for you?
So to be honest, the good fit scenario has only happened to us once in 13 years of summer programming.
Wow.
So because what we do is so specific, we have an arts program that is very, it's real, narrow, and we're a small organization. But the one time that it did happen, we just refunded from that moment on, because from our point of view, it's just much better for the organization, like from a kind of PR standpoint, from a potentially legal standpoint. It was just, it didn't feel like a fight that was worth fighting, and that would be good for anyone.
Right. And in that case too, sort of the component of duty of care, right? So you accepted the student, and assuming that they were clear about all of their challenges, discomforts, medications, whatever their story is, you accepted them eyes wide open. So there is some sort of legal obligation to that duty of care, assuming that they were transparent, which isn't always the case. But so I just sort of I'm agreeing with you with different words. Roisin.
I think kind of similar. I think you kind of said it right there, is the times that hasn't been as clear cut as when the parents have clearly not been honest about something, and it's truly put their kid and us more at risk in this situation. And that is a situation where, they weren't upfront when they said they would be. I think in most other situations, it's a conversation with the parent. Obviously depends if they've finished most of the trip,
right,
and this is an end of thing, or it's the beginning. So I feel like it's totally case dependent. But yeah, if it's something where we accepted them and it's just not working, then I think not keeping their money makes a lot of sense, because it is hard for them. And I liked your point of also following up with the student afterwards, because I do think that it can feel like a real failure. And that's a nice piece to it, to be able to keep that contact.
Yeah, agreed. Andrea?
Yeah, my question is, Ethan, do you think it's worthwhile having something in writing? I mean, it's tricky to have this in writing, isn't it? The not a good fit scenario, but what are your thoughts around that? Like having an actual written policy around these things?
So I strongly suggest each organization have its own internal written policy, and it's not a public external. It's totally an internal one, and it's usually tied to dates, percentages, and then there's a little bit of there's the occasional asterisk for a unique scenario, but usually it's sort of what it does is it just gives you safe harbor and a clear path forward for those challenging ones. In 90% of the cases, most attorneys will tell you, you got to protect your butt, in that CYA sort of way. So that the paperwork usually is pretty clear. Once it's paid, there's no refunds. And that just gives you legal sort of coverage. And then whenever you decide to go sort of more than that, then you just look generous, and you just know internally that sort of, the fight of finances isn't worth, the stress or the long-term impacts. So just write it off and have everyone be sort of generally better about it. In most cases, if you are going to do sort of if there is a student who leaves early, sort of my preferred suggestion, if it's not one of those clear cut sort of, this isn't just a good fit, we shouldn't have let you in, sort of that kind of thing, is run the numbers to see where you would have been if the student had completed the program. And then sort of whatever your margin is, keep that, and then refund everything else back that you can. So that it's as if the student completed. And then, because the last thing that the story that you don't want to tell is yeah, we made a lot more money off of all those students we kicked off. Yeah, isn't that great? No, that if that gets out, that's really bad for all of us. Yeah, so you just don't want to make a lot of money off of those students who really struggle out. The other thing too is, remember, a lot of them might be trying to use those funds that you refund back to them for their next thing, right? So because this is a large part of the stress and hassle from a parent's perspective, is I thought I knew what my kid was doing for the next semester, and now all of a sudden my kid's coming back in a week, and I've got work, I've got a conference, I've got all these other things going on, and now I have to not only sort of accept and deal with my kid coming back, who I love and I want to see, but we got to figure out what next steps are. That's going to be a week of full-time work. It adds up really, really quickly.
I have a question about that in terms of not a good fit. I mean, does that open up potential to some sort of discriminatory lawsuit? If you have a student maybe who's on the spectrum, or what constitutes not a good fit, and could a family come back and say, you're discriminating against my kid because he's awkward or whatever, or has a disability, or so I'm just wondering if that ever comes into play.
Yeah, it can. And largely that's where the EEC will come in. And one of those areas that this is one of those hard parts about sort of when we run accreditation work. Some organizations have an AEC that's half a page. And I always push back and I'm like, you got to do better. Technically you have an AEC, so I got to pass you on the standard, but you're opening the door for a lot more hard questions than answers. Some of the most developed ones, like if you look at Knowles's, it's like 6 or 8 pages. I'm not saying a 6 or 8 page one is good for most programs. I think a 1 to 2 pager is plenty for most programs. But Knowles is clear and solid, and they've got it broken down based on different types of programming. And what's great about that is it theoretically gives a little bit more insulation for those kinds of hardships. So that being said, one other component I'll add to it is the informed consent piece. So as long as you're engaging the family in the conversation as much as possible, that usually will sidestep some of the issues. But you've got more, Debbie, give it out.
No, just because you brought up Knowles and it just made me think. So I worked with a client many years ago who actually went on Knowles and was attacked by a bear. I don't know if you know that story.
I do. I was intimately familiar with it, actually. It was a tabletop scenario that we did at a WRMC conference a couple of years ago. Yeah.
Well, he was working with me. And the funny part of that is that we had written his essay before he left on the trip, because he had gone on the Knowles trip the summer before and he really wanted to write about, this great trip and everything. And then obviously his college essay changed quite a bit but it's so dramatic, that story, because it was about gratitude and how he was saved by, the Black Hawk helicopters came in and got him. And it was just such a crazy story. But, I still hear from the mom. He's actually in law school now. So he's thrived significantly, but it's just funny. I never even thought about that. Just when you said they have an 8-page EDC, I was like, oh, it's a good thing. So yeah, interesting.
This is a bad thing for college counselors. Like, if your student tells you they're going through this really hard time, it's like, well, you're going to get a good essay out of that.
We're always strategizing, right? It's like the like sickness of the work we do.
There's got to be some way to convert it. Yeah, no, that's great.
Good.
Yeah.
So it's funny, that scenario in Knowles, that was in Alaska, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
And they were on their own. Those kids were on their own. So I don't know if they still do that, but I remember because he was like the leader. They actually, they earn this sort of 3 or 4 day thing that they get to do this little excursion on their own, because it's the last leg of the trip and they had done so much and learned so much. So they were 7 kids on their own, and he was sort of the leader. And then the bear came and kind of attacked them. And he, it was very interesting because there was I don't know what you know of the story, but there was a boy who was an certified EMT on the trip with them, who was able to wrap, because it bit him in the head. So was able to wrap his head and actually like saved his life because he was bleeding to death, and which is incredible. And there was actually an ex-gang member on the trip too, who apparently was the one who like kicked the bear or like fought the bear back, that bear ran away or whatever. So it's funny now, but it was such a I remember the mom had called me and I was like, it was just tragic. And he has kind of like a Harry Potter scar on his head, which is sort of cool. They're a very, very amazing family. So
so Bruce Palmer was the director of Knowles Communication at the time. He's a friend of mine. Now he's running for political office in Wyoming there. And the stories that they sort of have told on those experiences, honestly, like they hired a PR firm, but when it all came down to it, it was handled so well by Knowles that none of the families wanted to sue. And Knowles just did such a great communications job. They brought in the right experts. They debriefed it all properly. And one of the things that I always like to suggest, in fact, there's a standard dedicated to this for programs, and consultants might consider this too, is if there is sort of, tragedy of the highest order, I just consider it a best practice that one of the executive team from the organization flies out to the host destination to meet the family and just be there, hold their hands. And sometimes that happens, like occasionally an organization will say, oh, I have a local ambassador. And I'm like, that's great. But in the worst moment of a parent's life, is that elevating this to the status that they're going to feel confident with? Because the answer is probably no. It can't be a local representative. It's got to be someone from HQ who's at the executive side, to deal with everything from, repatriation of remains to just dealing with, visa and immigration issues to any legal or liability concerns, and just sort of helping, figure out what next steps are. If there is something that's really bad that happens, does the group continue or does it stop, right? These are really big questions, right? Like in Knowles's case, it was the end of the program, so they were done. But if it had happened earlier, like that's a debate. And I've been in those scenarios where there was a student group in India hiking. They found a body of a man who had committed suicide. And so what do you do in that moment? Because this was the first time most of the students had seen a dead body, and now we had to talk about it. So that's why you have a clinician on call to help facilitate those conversations. It's why you do training in psychological first aid, PFA. That's why you do support mechanisms for your staff to hold the space for the students to go through whatever they have to go through, because it's triggering. I mean, how could it not be? Jane?
I was just thinking about, I don't know if you've shared the stats with this group, but that you shared last time about a program that you were involved with that even the students who went home most said that they would recommend it. And putting this together with what Debbie said earlier about it, it's different than the college consulting where we're just like kind of getting them in the door, where really the quality of the program is shown when things go wrong.
Yes.
And it's also remind like the the customer service stories, when something goes wrong and it's handled well, then the parent tells 20 people, and it's really even good business sense to handle it well when things go badly.
It totally is. So yeah, last institute you heard me talk about, I'm not going to talk about the percentages, but well, no, I will. So yeah, in 4% of the case that we used to send a student home, we used to send students home at roughly 2 to 4% of sort of like number of students going home. And in roughly half to 2/3 of the cases, the students would sort of still recommend the program after the fact, which I always consider is sort of a good feather in the cap for you're doing something right. Students are feeling held. There's a conversation that they needed to have, and they knew they needed to have, and they're better off for having had it. Yeah, it's an interesting conversation there. Let's see, where else do we want to go? So it's about 11 o'clock. We've got an hour to do breakouts and worksheets, which we could do if there's specific standards you want to work through. Alternatively, I've got this other idea, which we didn't quite get to up until now, but stories of standards past. Sometimes just going through the standards and being told the story that's behind it can really be quite illustrative, for the why that's behind it, and how it's evolved over the course of time. So I guess sort of what would be most helpful to do that. There might be someone else from the standards committee coming in today. It turns out most everyone who's going to come in from the standards committee is coming in tomorrow. So there's going to be a sort of a better sort of phalanx of supporters to do breakouts for consultants and programs if that's what you want. Today it's a little bit more anemic, in part because it's the Wednesday thing, which is a scheduling guffaw on my part. I should have waited until next week. But what's helpful for folks? Do you want to dive into specific standards, or sort of hear some stories of standards past? Are you in the mood for story time?
I mean, I always like to know the why behind things in general. I always find that to be super helpful. So that's my vote. And are we going to take those 5-minute breaks? Those are just good bathroom breaks. When at each hour, just, if that's possible.
Totally. Yeah, totally. Thanks, Debbie, for that. Yeah. We'll probably take a break as soon as we figure out what we're going to do next, and come back at the top of the hour. That makes sense.
Yeah, I agree. The story sounds good.
Okay, great. Andrea, Roisin, same. Okay, great. Well, let's take a quick 10-minute. We'll come back at the top of the hour. And get your blankets, get your tea. We'll have a story session.
Ethan, I have a question about the first standard, since you're in the space.
Sure. Go ahead. Yeah.
I thought I might throw it out there.
Yeah.
So we're trying to develop a staff training manual. All of our faculty are professional artists. So we're trying to develop ways to train them in what is experiential education and develop ways to connect the pedagogy of experiential education with what they do and what we do as industry professionals. Do you have any resources that could potentially help us? Anybody who's done any work in this field, any books we could reference? We're just trying to reach out and find resources to develop that a little more.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, AEE, the Association for Experiential Education, is the first place that comes to mind.
Okay.
There's a couple thoughts that I have that are sort of just in terms of well, how would they teach? Let me ask you that. Sort of, it's not a virtual environment, it's all in person, smoke?
Yeah, it's all in person. It's all in person. And, it's interesting. So for example, like we're doing a lot in the filmmaking world now, like film is really hot now. And, traditionally teaching filmmaking is about developing hard skills. It's a technical skill, filmmaking. So we're trying to educate, professional artists about soft skill building, you know what I mean? And even though it's something that's a byproduct of what we do artistically, it proves challenging, you know what I mean? Because to get them to understand how learning how to use a camera can potentially be linked into emotional intelligence and critical thinking. And we're finding that we're not finding a lot of resources. I don't know, maybe no one's tried to do this before. I'm not sure. So
well,
maybe we're pioneering something.
Yeah. I mean, yes and no. Like, I mean, there's a art history abroad. They're a group out of the UK who do sort of experiential art programs. Irish Gap Year, they also are doing an art and culture program.
It's on my list to talk to here because they accredited. But is AHA an accredited program with you guys?
They're not accredited with us, no. Right. I think they flirted with it off and on over the years, and then COVID hit, and they just sort of hibernated for a bit. I'm still in great contact with the folks over at AHA. They run great programs. They get great reviews. There used to be a program, and this was a favorite of mine for a couple years. Sadly, it all sort of went under before COVID. I think just because sort of financially managing it all, it's a different skill set than running a program. The concept was a documentary. So it was I think a 10-month experience where they sort of embed them onto a campus, train them on sort of documentary, like how to do storyboarding, how to do the interviews, all of just sort of the technical aspects. And then they road tripped and put them up in a house in New Orleans. This was after Katrina. So students could sort of have so many different options for where they took their documentary in New Orleans. And they road tripped to Salt Lake City, Utah, same thing. So many, like just such a hodgepodge of great sort of things happening. And then they sort of turned that into a documentary. And then at one point they had all this camera equipment that they were trying to sell. And if I had like 15 grand, I would have been the happiest kid ever.
But I'll definitely make some time to reach out to Irish Gap here, because you're right. I think he's going to have some great ideas about that. Totally. And look at Association for Experiential Education as well. Thank you. Yeah. But if anything pops to mind, or if you run into anyone, I'm interested. There
is one person, his name is, so I used to work with him. He used to be the director of education at AEE. His name is Dan, what's your last name? He runs a company now called Fifth Pillar Consulting. Dan Miller is his name. And it's called Fifth Pillar Consulting, and his whole thing is sort of bringing experiential ed into sort of areas that it's less sort of intersected. Really cool guy. If there's anyone that could take a curriculum and turn it into an experiential sort of explosion of the best possible ways, Dan would be one of the top.
Okay, because that's the first standard there, isn't it? Organizations pedagogy is congruent with gap year education. So trying to match those things up of what we're doing now and what experiential education means, and trying to create a training manual around that.
Yeah, exactly.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah, of course, good. All right.
I just have a super quick question.
Sure.
So Marion, who was on yesterday, she's a consultant, was she just one of the speakers, or is she doing this? She was so helpful.
Good question. Yeah, Marion she's a godsend. She shows up at a lot of these things. She's a former board member. She's on the membership committee. Truthfully, I think gap year consultants benefit from GYA probably more than many others, just by virtue of the fact that you operate independently, and sort of it's the sense of community. If you want to do something with other people that isn't sort of a direct student relationship, this is sort of one of the few ways to do it. No, she's not attending the Institute. She's attending as sort of really one of two things. One is either an accredited consultant just to sort of be a resource, just as Jay is here to do for you all. Or otherwise, Marion's just kind of here to be on a fly on the wall for the membership committee that she's one of the co-chairs for. We're launching, the idea is to turn these institutes into an annual thing every year. Hopefully build on them, get a little bit more momentum, sort of what works, what hasn't worked, those kinds of things. So she's coming in as an assistant, but really to also sort of be a critical eye for the whole thing. Yeah.
Great.
Yeah. And Jay, so we've got a tight group of 4 today, evenly split, 2 consultants, 2 providers. For the next hour, I had asked everyone if they would prefer to do some dives into specific standards, sort of that they're just sort of in the grist of, either as a program or a consultant, or if they wanted some story time to just better understand the standards. Just because, you know how it is, Jay, each one of these standards, there's a story or 10 we could tell. And they opted for story time, which makes my heart really happy, because it's a gray day outside. I said it yesterday, there's not a cloud in the sky because it's covered in clouds. So typically Portland. So I was going to just sort of dive in and start sort of running through some story time on the standards, but Jay, just because we have you, in particular to Debbie and to Jane, just wanted to uplift this guy as a sort of a notable resource. You won't probably have a ton of access to him. He's a very busy guy. He's also on the standards committee as one of the co-chairs. But he's one of the most knowledgeable about programs, and I think he and his wife bring to the table something that frankly I think the two of you and I are one of the only ones to do. Is we know programming as sort of running a program, being in the field, working with students, all the way up to running the program, to doing the consulting and the oversight. Like, we've seen it at every level, and there's just very few people who have that sort of skill set in their belts, and Jay is one of them. So if you have questions for him sort of with that perspective in mind, would encourage sort of, availing ourselves of his expertise. Otherwise, I'm happy to dive into story time. So Jane and Debbie, I'll just give you a moment. If you have any questions to ask Jay from a sort of a professional background perspective, now's a great opportunity to do it. And if not, that's fine too.
I guess that when we asked for story time, we didn't think Jay was around.
Exactly.
And the providers didn't really step in. So I didn't want to, force that on them. And if Jay's going to be around and, they want to talk more about standards, and we could talk about standards as they apply to us, that would, maybe we could split the time. I don't know.
Yeah. I'm down for that, or we could do a breakout room and send Debbie, Jane, and Jason off and get some intimate time to talk about sort of the practical aspects of that. And then Roisin and Andrea and we can either dive into story time or see where that takes us. So let's do that. I'm gonna set up a quick breakout room.
Okay.
So. So we're going to give you. All right. I think I did this right. There we go. All right. It looks like that worked. Brilliant. All right. Well, hey, I'm Andrea Roisin. How are you? Welcome. We have a more intimate setting. I feel like I should talk in a quiet tone today.
Feels like a privilege. We have you all to ourselves.
Take advantage. What do you want? Let's give it all. Let's dive in. Tackle the world's problems one issue at a time.
I have a little practical thing just to throw out there. So as you know, I'm in this phase of like gathering resources and looking for all the things I can get my hands on in every like risk management assessment of every company that I can read. So so when you reference on the GYA website, so in the standards right now, it says, for example, focus on teaching students experientially about risk management awareness, see your GYA membership account. When you link to those things, it looks like they haven't been transferred over from the old site because a lot of those links go nowhere for those resources for accreditation.
Yes.
Yeah, so I don't know if that's been flagged up or not, and if those resources will be live and available, or they're being updated somehow, or...
They are all there, actually. Just the links in the old 2018 version of the standards haven't been updated.
Okay.
So
when is the 2020 coming online?
2022 is what it's going to be. And
sorry,
so,
2022. That's what I meant.
I know. Yeah, we're just over 2020 and 21. We just wanted to move on.
My head's still back in 2020 and the world stopped, you know. So
I just wanted to fast forward. I mean, we all kind of wanted to, except we just get to, bureaucratically. No. So the 2022 standards, so we're like a day away from finishing the current set, and then we have to go through there's three different ratification processes. One is for the fair trade learning, because we've got a totally renewed version of the fair trade learning standards that we're really, really excited to push out. And it's a collaboration with Eric Hartman's, it's literally called The Collaborative is the name of his organization. It's a very, very higher ed hippie group of sort of do-gooders that are awesome human beings. So fair trade learning is one sort of process that we have to go through. The efficiency subcommittee is another process that we have to go to, and then final ratification of the entire 2022 standard. So I think we're probably 2 meetings, maybe 3 meetings into 2022. So realistically, like let's do
by Christmas, really, by holidays, it'll
it's going to be like, no, it's going to be like Q1 Q2 2022. So like probably my hope is March-ish, April-ish of 2022 for the new set of standards. And again, like I think I said this on day one, is whatever you start with, you finish with. So if you apply and start the engagement letter on the 2018 standards, then those are the standards that we push out for you to fill out. We don't all of a sudden expunge those and push the new ones in. Or if you want to wait until 2022, quite honestly, I think that like every year it's an improvement. There's going to be fewer standards. They're going to be theoretically easier to understand and figure out exactly what we mean. And, we've done it now enough times. So waiting until 2022 is probably fine. At this
Given
point.
that we haven't had our first group yet, we're not really in a position to apply.
Yeah, totally.
So we'll wait.
So when you do get there, let me see if I'm going to share my screen, and hopefully this doesn't share for the whole breakout room. For all of the breakout rooms. So this is the organizational account. So if you go to programs, program dashboard login.
Yeah.
You might get so you log in here, and then if you go to accreditation, that's the actual application. The FAQ is what this is. And so this is generally like, these resources are generally what these things are referring to.
Yeah. Yeah, because I just had to look through a lot of these today.
Yeah.
Yeah, and some of them, when you click the further links, it goes back to the old website.
Let
So
me see if you have an account here, because I can check real quick. I can set you up with an account, and it doesn't really cost us anything. It's like, I mean, you're already a member. This is a pathway you're going to get to eventually. So
okay.
let me just see if you have an account here. Rasheen, do you have an account for this? You do? Okay.
So this is like the login you would get after you've done your letter to apply.
Exactly. After you've done the engagement letter. Yeah.
Okay.
So yeah, it does look like you have it. Your username is Barrage Programs, all one word, lowercase.
Yep.
And it's a password reset that will go to you. I don't have access to what the password is. So if you do sort of want to access it, you can do a password reset. It should come back to you.
Okay. So I'm logged into the dashboard right now.
Okay.
So if I go to member benefits and then I press on the accreditation link I'm just wondering how I get to the screen that you were just showing me. And then it says accreditation help.
I have no idea what you are showing. Do you want to share your screen real quick? I'll make you a co-host.
Okay. Sorry, Rasheen. No, Rasheen's coming up against my technology shortcoming.
You're fine. I have been in the same boat. I've now got it saved as a bookmark.
Okay.
There are two different logins. There's one that's Mighty Networks. That's Mighty Networks. That's what you're looking at.
Okay. Yeah, because when I log in, this is what I see, which is the dashboard, right? So
okay. So yeah, go ahead.
How do I get out of here?
So right now, so if you look at the top URL, you're in Mighty Networks. So what you want to do is scroll to the left of, or let me, hold on. So do you see the on the upper left corner of the screen, there's it looks like the homepage of the website. Yeah, click on that.
Yep.
That's going to take you to the GYA website. So Mighty Networks theoretically is where we have it set up for networking. It's one of the most common things that people have asked for. So we invested a good deal of energy, and we haven't obviously hit the mark on it. So two options. One is mouse over programs, and then down below you should see program dashboard login. Or you can scroll down from the homepage of GYA, and there's all of the sidebar menus. On the right there, you see it says join as a member. There's a login option.
Okay, so my username is Barrage Programs.
Yep.
You're saying.
Yep.
And then let's just try this password. Wow. Fantastic. Thank you.
Yeah,
so I was in the wrong place. That's why I didn't see it. That's great. Thank you.
It's confusing. This is one of the things that we struggled with for Mighty Networks is this dashboard. It's really only relevant for programs, and programs happens to be our sort of one of our largest membership sort of constituents. But it's only relevant for programs. And so judging that it's only relevant for programs, we sort of put the majority of the membership information into Mighty Networks, and are trying to sort of like all of the accountingers in Mighty Networks specifically because we want people to get comfortable around what's the networking that they can do sort of conversation wise, back channel, all that kind of good stuff.
Okay, great. Thank you. It's really helpful.
I love that worked out.
It's nice when things work.
Well, yeah, it doesn't happen as much these days, but yeah, I'll take them where I can get them. And it is worth noting that the misspelling accreditation in Mighty Networks, we had an intern build it, and he's a great guy, and he's an intern.
Oh,
I love it. Okay, so with the yeah, since Jay's taken the rest of the folks off, I can still sort of run through, some of the stories and sort of get into some of the details. If there are specific elements of your program, or even just like marketing, just like business aspects of the work that you all do, now's a great sort of opportunity to throw some pasta and see if I can catch it in my mouth. No, that metaphor broke down a little bit at the end there. To throw some things my way
on the wall.
Yeah.
See what sticks.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, there's so many things. I love stories. I feel like potentially there's standards that both Andrea and I have thought about. I feel like that hearing the story and understanding. Also, for me, I think a lot of it is finding what is the best practice, because I can see how these things happen and have ideas, but just bolstering it more so.
Yeah.
But also, I don't know where you want to go, Andrea. You can ask business stuff too. There's always a lot of things there.
Yeah, I'm kind of open. Yeah, I mean, yeah, Roshi, why don't you take the floor for a while, since I've had a few questions answered already.
Well, I think first, one thing that I'm curious to hear how other organizations have done it is like around post-program interactions with students and professionalism and staff boundaries, which is a big piece that I spend a lot of time thinking about and working on. I feel like trying to define professionalism, particularly in the outdoor industry, is very difficult. And it's something I'm working hard on doing. And I think there's lessons that can be created, but also realizing that there needs to be harder lines drawn. And I think it applies to you too, Andrea. The being a mentor is so important, to have that vulnerability and close connection. And I think I liked the way it's broken down in the standards, saying, that the power differentials and discussing that and kind of laying everything out on the table is important. But that's a piece that I would love to hear, ways that organizations have tackled that.
Yeah, that's such a big one, and such a complicated one. I've literally been the instructor who got stuck with a student on a flight kerfuffle that had us overnight in the El Salvador airport, back when El Salvador was even scarier than it is now. And that was a very interesting, experience. I've also had plenty of stories. I had one experience where I was the boss of two staff. One of the staff was hooking up with teenagers the same age group of the students, but locals. And then we were left struggling with, how do you deal with the scenario? At the time, I wasn't the boss, but the boss made, I think, a very challenging response to ask the female employee what she wanted to do with the male employee. Because that's an impossible scenario then, because if she says, yes, I want him gone, now he's after her. There's a couple weeks when she's just in charge, and that's not good. And also, that's not what she's hired to do. That's not her job. She has no training on any of those kinds of things. My strong opinion in that case was that we as the organization should have come out and said, male instructor, you are going home unless something changes. Back channel to the female instructor, say, is there any, like, if you want to go to bat for him, I'm receptive, but otherwise I'm making plans for a 1-week turnover. And that's the only way that I think it could have actually gone successfully. So here's the scenario. Post-program interaction, like one of the common things is obviously around like social networks, right? Just sort of figuring out you will always act in a professional environment, or you are always sort of representing the organization. Another way that organizations will do it is they'll put a time limit on it and say, for 2 months, sort of, we need this. Other organizations will fully enshrine a list of prohibited behaviors, drinking, doing drugs, having sex with, those kinds of things. Now, legally, I don't know that you really can sort of enforce any of that. It basically becomes sort of, if they run afoul of it, then you're just not going to hire that person again, and they wouldn't get a reference check positive downstream. The other scenario that comes up pretty commonly is, imagine either end of program, you're overseas, and some students are staying behind while the rest of the group leaves. And you've got 1 or 2 of your staff that are staying behind as well. And they're probably behind, staying, a week or 2 just to close out the books and the programming. So they still have a sort of legal obligation in that way to the job. But there's also this other thing called implied liability, which is to say that just because, like, for the last 3 months, that staff person has literally been the safeguard person for that student. And just because a date has come and gone, it is irrational to think that a student will somehow magically just say, oh, okay, now I'm fully independent, and all of a sudden, ipso facto, all of the things line up. It just doesn't work like that. So I always like to suggest, sort of like, again, trust in God, but tie your camel too. like if I ever had a student who left a program early, legally speaking, the lawyers would probably say, don't further enmesh yourself, draw clear lines, don't give a cell phone, those kinds of things. I tend to think about it more in the duty of care space than in the don't ask, don't tell space, which is if I'm going to show to you that I'm dedicated to your safety and I'm going to do everything I can to sort of show that, to actually, follow through with that, then I'm going to be on firmer legal ground. If the worst does happen, I want to be able to stand up on that sort of court and say, I did everything I could. And that's generally what I like to suggest. So yes, like a couple ideas for how an organization might do this. I've seen some organizations, because there's another standard about sort of having clear start and end dates, and it goes in the same sort of direction as the standard, is either having a student sign a contract at the end of the program. Great, I am formally withdrawing from the program. And so that's the start and end. The end date is whenever that document is signed. I've seen some organizations do a sort of after the ceremony, and that's okay. It's not very sort of hard and fast, but sort of you kind of get a sense. I tend to sort of do everything I can to talk organizations out of saying at the airport. I've got a story of a student who decided to, on the way to the airport, he was staying behind, ran a moto scooter in the middle of Roatan, Honduras, took his girlfriend out who was going home in hours, and didn't know that might makes right in most developing countries on the road. And when you're the moto scooter, you're the smallest thing on that road. And he ended up in a ditch. He ended up almost tearing her ACL, was in the hospital there for like 2 or 3 days, had to change all of these flights, tons of legal maneuvering. The student who ended up running the scooter also, by the way, ended up wrecking it to another car. So there was an insurance settlement. So that's where it all starts to sort of get clearer and clearer. I tend to suggest that if you can do a sort of a like, even if it's just a certificate of completion at the end of a program, that's a really natural and uplifting way to close out and define next steps for behaviors. Because what you can do is it's a two-step thing. One is it's reflective, right? What did you get? What worked? What didn't work? It's sort of one of the great outcomes that I think a program can offer is a letter of reference for a student afterwards. And I think about it in the same vein. You're pulling a lot of the same content there. The other thing that letter is doing is you're establishing clear boundaries for sort of, this is the end of the program. You are now officially on your own. Here's access to the 24-hour emergency line. Your insurance is still good until whatever. I mean, you don't have to go too far down that rabbit hole, but it's a clear sort of like, now it's this and instead of that. The other scenario that oftentimes happens that I'm concerned with is student. This happens in Knowles in Lander, Wyoming. At the end of a program, there's one bar, and everyone's come back, and so now the staff are like, great, I want to have some drinks, I've earned it. It's long days doing program staffing, but when you see a student there, what do? Is the policy you should not engage with the student? Is the policy you can drink with the student? Is the policy you have to be sort of a professional to the best of your abilities, and you're free to do whatever you want, which I think is what Knowles is. Theirs is sort of a little bit loose, honestly. But it's also sort of smashing together all of the real world considerations of end of program. Like the staff, I can't literally tell the staff person they can't drink at the public bar. I can't tell the student that they can't sort of have a beer if they're over 21 and the bar will serve them. What we can do is sort of have those kinds of brief agreements, and so you'll put it into the staff job description. You will have it be part of your policies for post-program engagement. That's going to be social media. It's going to be drugs and alcohol and relationships and communication. For me, I think that the easiest path is to set a target of like a month or something. And even just recognizing that you can't enforce it. So being extra detailed doesn't necessarily help you. most organizations will sort of backstop it and just say it's you just have to continue to act in the professional role that you had for the organization for the duration of that period.
I like that. And I think ours is a little easier because we are sending off students, like we're not in a situation where they're around us too much after. I like the idea of, I think for a lot of staff, if they know what we're expecting, they'll follow it. It's when it's unclear and you do have this close relationship with a student and they are, older and you're becoming friends, it's figuring out what. So I like that idea and the time limit. Do you have any suggestions for, I feel like students, staff, it's easier to make them take it seriously. And I like the talking about that power dynamic, which to me is really important because you're so close in age, but you just have such a strong impact on the student that you can't even understand a lot of the time.
Yeah.
And I don't think everyone does. So I think that's curriculum I feel pretty comfortable adding into orientation. I think for students, it's harder to make them take it seriously if they were to be interested in an instructor and setting strong policies, but also finding a way to not just say, well, it was written in the manual, or you said it once awkwardly, but make it clear. So I don't know if you have advice there.
That's a tough one. I'd say a lot of that, it has to be, you can't really put much of that on the student. That's just not sort of reasonable. It's got to be on the staff. Having anonymous staff reporting procedures and processes is really helpful so that one person can report another and feel like it's before it becomes a big issue. Having the staff who are trained up, because this was one of the ahas for me early on when I was leading groups. I was 23. I shouldn't have been leading groups at 23. I just didn't understand sort of the difference between words and actions. So I had a female student who was totally coming on to me all the time, and I would tell her no, but then she would come in and sort of give hugs, and she's just a huggy people. That was what the community did, was a lot of hugs. Hers were just sort of a little bit longer than they should have been. And so I was like, but I'm saying the thing. And what I didn't understand was that sort of the physical statement was at contrast to the stated statement. And that was sending her mixed messages. And so, just some training and understanding around that. So I feel like it does have to be on the educational front for your staff. And it really does have to be playing through sort of specific dynamics. Is like every time I do a staff training, it's always an outcome is we should have done more scenarios, and every training we don't do enough. And this is one of those areas where I think it's a really good scenario to inject with, because it does tap into those power differentials. And again, for the student, you are keeping them alive. That's their perception. Once a staff person sees that, I think it changes their reality in a needed way. But I don't know that anyone ever walked me to that door when I was, new to leading.
I guess that was really helpful. I agree. Scenarios is exactly what we came up with after this summer. The one other piece I have with that is setting up, because it's not on the students, but at the same time, there is a part where if staff are doing the right thing and are setting themselves up and are holding that boundary, and students push it to a point, I guess having as a policy is that probably more of a conversation, hey, if this continues like this, you are breaking a policy. If they are to keep going, would you say that's the best way to handle that? Because at some point, if it's making a staff uncomfortable, that's also
I would say you still have to run through the warning process. You're still going to have it's going to be, you have to couch it into a policy of, treating each other with respect or something nebulous like that. There's one of the catch-alls that's definitely going to be in. And it's going to be an awkward dynamic for that staff person and the student for the rest of the program. Some organizations have as a default 3 field staff with every cohort so that can sort of be diffused out. I've oftentimes find having a third staff that there's always a third wheel. The work is done by 2, and then there's a third who's just kind of there. So we used to try and have like 2 field staff and 1 assistant, but sort of when you're in the field, there's not really such a clean division of labor. It's all got to get done. So yeah, that's a tough one. So yeah, most organizations will have like a red and a yellow policies sort of set up, right? And this is going to be in the yellows policy probably. And so, you know, this is sort of that scenario we were talking about earlier this morning where sort of you have to confront the student. Ideally, you're talking about a specific policy, giving them some corrective behaviors that they can do. One of my, so full disclosure, I started and founded a company called Carpe Diem Education. And one of the things that they use is sort of, oh gosh, what's it called? They create effectively a B plan for every student who's having sort of an issue. So rather than student you're going on contract, there's a B plan, which is a behavioral correction plan. So they identify sort of what's the behavior, what's the lagging indicator, right? The fundamental presumption is that the student wants to stay, they want to correct their behavior, they just don't know what the behavior to be corrected is or how to do it. And so that's what the behavioral plan is sort of designed for. At the end of the behavioral plan is, you know, now at the end of it, there's a written sort of statement of what the behaviors were, what the corrections need to be, and typically some sort of timeline. So it effectively acts as a contract, but sort of the impetus from how it's delivered is a very different sort of place. And then if it's a red flag issue, then it's just sort of one and done, right? Like drugs would be a red flag issue, you know, where physically assaulting someone would be a red flag issue. Yeah. The staff engagements with students they're tough. They really are. Student, I mean, especially earlier on into the program, especially at the wings of the program, right at the end when it feels like there's no consequences, right? Like, what are you going to do? Kick me off? There's a week left. Like, I've had students do that before, and you're like, well, no, but because the logistics of getting you out would take as long as we have. No, but you're not going to scuba dive and all of you know, the fun sort of hoorah stuff, like you don't get to join in those. And so, you know, that's something that you can do. But the hard part with this stuff is I always times feel like if you're taking a punitive approach with a young person in an experiential program, it rarely pencils how you want it to. Like the punitive approach you think is corrective of behavior, but it ends up seemingly reinforcing the behavior and also sort of you know, working at odds to the educational outcomes, right? Like what's after the behavior. And so, you know, like in some cases, you know, like that autistic kid who just, I can only hear it this way, you know, that you can still deliver the thing in a non-punitive way. But even when they don't need the sort of that type of sort of language, punitive rarely works. So enrolling them in some sort of educational strategy, you know, educate, legislate, or engineer. Those are really helpful rubrics that I keep coming back to again and again.
No, that's incredibly helpful. Thank you. Yeah, nice to hear. It is a tricky one. Unfortunately, it's a blessing that we get to be so close to students and show so much care, but because of that, there needs to be clear boundaries.
And the other thing too is, you know, midway evals so that students have a clear pathway, you know, anonymous reporting for students. Sometimes I'll just tell a student, if you like our anonymous process is go to the website of the organization and submit a contact us form and make up your email address and just submit it. And that way, I don't know where it came from, but I can tell you there's a problem on that group and now I can put my attention to it. So having those anonymous pathways to communicate is really important. Having the regular intersections on program, be they through sort of one-on-ones, you know, peer feedback, you know, group art projects, something where they can have a sort of a perpendicular way to tell you without having it, you know, hit you on the head. And inevitably, you know, the rest of the cohort sees the problem before the staff do. And so, you know, you're going to read that hopefully pretty well. I've had it happen once that a local contact was spotting group dynamic issues and then brought those to the program director. And that was a godsend. That's why it's nice to have good contacts. But usually it's the students who are just sort of raising something. That's why, you know, yeah. Good questions, Roisin. Bring them on more if you have them. Andrea, if you have any, it's feel free to throw them out. Otherwise, we can talk about insurance and $2 million and scuba insurance and yay.
No, that was a great question. Thanks for that one, Roisin. Because we work in the arts, so everything's closeness and community, and similar. We have similar struggles.
Do you each have policies around like against giving back rubs to students? No physical contact unless you're in a sort of a crowded environment. Don't ever be alone with those students. Those kinds of things. Yeah.
And I don't know what you find, Roisin, but that it's boundaries are kind of like getting bigger, it's getting to be a bigger topic. You know what I mean? It's coming more and more into the forefront, I think, so.
As a result of COVID, do you think, or just sort of?
I think post Me Too, I think there was a big shift after that for sure. And then probably around COVID, people feeling less safe and more aware about health and safety in general. But 3 or 4 years ago, we had to, because we do a lot of one-to-one coaching previously, in the arts, and we had to basically completely negate that. We had to pull the plug on all that because, it wasn't acceptable for any adult to be alone with any student in any situation, but that started to develop about 6 years ago, maybe, Previously, it wasn't a thing. It wasn't on the table really. So we've noticed a lot of changes in those dynamics. Yeah.
One of my ahas this last couple of years has been I got into the work when we were running programs for millennials, and I think I was slow to the awareness that sort of the demographic had changed, that a Gen Z student is a much different student than a millennial student. And one of the things that I love about the Gen Z students is that awareness of Me Too is a recognition that emotional violence can be just as, if not more, harmful than physical violence. And I'm so happy that this is sort of permeating their culture and hopefully going to get into more of the adults' cultures, because it's not just Me Too, it's sort of the psychological wounds from Iraq and Afghanistan. And a recognition and sort of around, why is it that fewer and fewer students are willing to shoot the moon, right? Give me my 1 week experience, then I can talk about a 3 week experience, then I might dream about a semester experience, but 1 week is where I'm starting, right? And that's as far as they're willing to go. Like they watch their forebears, the millennials, shoot the moon for like I want to be an astronaut, and they all failed when the Great Recession happened. So Gen Z tends to take a much more conservative approach to profession and career, which is to say, I'm going to keep the dream. I'll still read the NASA books, but I'm going to be an accountant, and that's what I'm going to build first, and then everything else is sort of it's my dream space. But I'm much more grounded in the reality of sort of things in that way. It's an interesting thought. There's a great book by Jean Twenge, PhD, just called, I think it's Gen Z, the future of whatever. Really well researched. She's out of UC, one of the University of California schools, and not surprisingly used their students a lot for the research, and it was incredibly helpful. It was helpful to define, for instance, like sort of how did Gen Z become Gen Z, right? Like millennials were defined by 9/11. What defined Gen Z? Well, fewer parties, fewer of them have a driver's license. Just doesn't seem as necessary anymore. A little bit closer to home, right? Less risk tolerant. Yeah. Anyway, Andrea, I'm going to shut up. Go ahead.
So just to say that was really helpful. So thank you. Yeah.
Do you have a standard or something in particular, Andrea? If not, I have one.
Yeah, we do. We have some in our staff training manual about boundaries. I'm always interested in looking at other stuff too. So if you'd like to trade and swap, I'm very game for that. So yeah.
Great. We're definitely building it up. Learning.
Yeah. And what's an interesting transition for us is previously a lot of our work involved minors. So now we're transitioning into, this is a much, much more difficult area when you have actual young adults that technically are capable of consent. And you said the exact right phrase, hitting the nail on the head, which is power dynamics, all about power dynamics. And of course, Me Too was about power dynamics. So
Well, and you add to that sort of the sort of LGBTQ question, right? Like, where do you house students now, right? That wasn't I have a story to tell of a Black male student who was housed with 2 white female students in a tent. Somehow that was the right decision at the time. And all of the bad things happened that you could possibly imagine. Well, not the worst things, but enough that it all kind of blew up. And, you know, at least one student's life is forever changed. The male student, he thought he was getting signals, and the female student definitely wasn't getting them. And there was a cultural divide, but then now there's sort of 3 white girls and 1 Black dude. And it's just like, oh God, this is, there's all of the unconscious stories that are there too. Yeah. Andrew, did you have a standard or a question that sort of we can work with on together? Or?
Yeah, mine is a complete like shift of gear, if you don't mind, dipping into something else. Mine is about risk management assessments. And one of the things that we're thinking about is, do you think it's preferred to have risk management assessment for every single situation? Like, how far do you go with that? And I mean, we don't do anything in the outdoor adventure programming world. So it's like, is a trip to the D-Day landing beaches risky? You know what I mean? Like, it's a kind of like, should we be thinking about it on that level in terms of pursuing accreditation? What do you guys look for? How robust should all that be?
Yeah, good question.
Yeah.
So let's see here. Do a search for.
And what is best practice as an organization? I mean, maybe it's best practice to say, everywhere we go, we should actually have a risk assessment,
So generally, yes, everywhere you go, you should have a risk assessment. And what you're generally asking for is, what's the reliability of police and emergency services? What's the time to sort of, that appendectomy we talked about yesterday? Is there access to like evacuation sort of, processes, helicopters, planes, boats, those kinds of things. Perfect example. I had a student group that was in, I'll just tell it. They were in Fiji. The local community, they were staying at a homestay. The local community had this sort of place that they always used to cliff jump and dive into water 15 feet up, not a huge height, but enough so for some consideration. The staff person didn't bring his cell phone, didn't bring his wallet, and didn't bring the med kit. And sure as heck, one of the students was running, slipped coming off the cliff, hit his head on the cliff going down, tumbled on the water. The male staff person dove in and totally saved his life. Knock on wood. But now the staff person was traumatized, the rest of the cohort was traumatized, the student was traumatized, the parents had to fly in. And in many ways, if the staff person had walked into that scenario and said, okay, what's the consideration? The only way to evac is on a mule. We're not going to do this. This is just not the right decision to do here. So we're going to give this area a red flag for anything moderately risky. So ideally, you have something built for each location that your students will regularly go. And theoretically, that needs to be reviewed at least on an annual basis. Now, 9 out of 10 times, that's going to be done sort of in the back of your brain by someone who happens to have a high degree of regional expertise. If it gets written up in a document book, all the more powerful. Just don't do what most people do, right? Like stick that book on a shelf and forget about it until next year. That needs to get shared out to the community. And partially what you're doing is detailing sort of specifics for that location, but you're also sort of reaffirming the risk culture, right? That's one of the reasons why when people talk about risk management, one of the things that they always talk about is having a group of people that are evaluating risk. If it's one person, there's just blind spots. There's too many blind spots. So oftentimes that's your programs team and maybe someone who's outside of programs team, just to add the diversity of the lens.
And I can share with you, Andrea, too. I mean, it's different for us what we do because we're in the backcountry so often, but we have trip notes that basically you have to carry with you at all times, which is a little different for your situation, but it just has the hospitals, evacuation, people to contact and numbers. And you can put all of that in one document and just have people carry it with them or on their.
Yeah, I would love to see that. I mean, one of the conversations we've had here, particularly since I signed up for this institute, is, hey, what if we approached everything we did like it was a backcountry? You know what I mean? What if we had that level of health and safety? You know what I mean? That, like, how great would we feel? You know what I mean? Like, and because, yeah, so we're thinking about treating ourselves like an adventure company. So I would love to see that. Yeah. And have, the most robust, standards and protocols and all that training. So
yeah, I'll send it on. And I think it's helpful. I mean, for me, being a staff member, having that, I think you go through it in training, and yes, you talk about it once and then you don't need to go back, but it's in the back of your mind. Something bad happens, I know where to look, rather than.
Because I think potentially, we are a little bit in danger of being lured into the fact that, we do this very safe, lovely thing in the arts, in France, in one location, we're not in a third world country. It's easy to kind of, do you know what I mean? To get in that mindset of like, it's great. It's first world. It's Europe. What could go wrong?
So there's a couple standards in GYA standards specifically about a Paris incident where the college had booked and rented rooms for the students. One of them happened to be on the third floor of a building. And they just thought, well, it's Paris, it's France. Surely they have adequate fire controls and sprinkler mechanisms, but it's old buildings and a lot of them have been grandfathered in, and that's what happened. And two of the students jumped out of the third story building. One of them died. The other severely broke her legs and a bunch of other sort of medical issues. And because the university had rented the room, it was on them. That was like one heck of an insurance lawsuit. But yeah, you got to think through it quite a bit. I think it's another question too is sort of like where do you store the documents? Because I think having them on you at all times, one of the things I'm always keen to point out is how often have you been in the developing world and power goes out, or your cell phone runs out of battery and there's not a good place to charge it nearby. So having it, a lot of organizations are like, oh yeah, we've got it in the cloud. And I'm like, that's great, but you need to download it and require that your staff download it. And I would prefer that they have it on paper, just because then there's no chance the battery's going to roll out, but you could lose it, get damaged anyway too. I'm happy to make that concession. If you put it in the cloud, you got to download it. My preference would be that you have it on a physical piece of paper with you.
And we have all of that along with, like, it's in a notebook, and you have your wallet, your phone. Yeah. And your med kit, and you have that, and it just makes it's like known that you have it with you.
It just used to call it the brain, like just take the brain with you. That's literally what we would call it. And it was a plastic sort of file thing that wasn't too big, and it had the budget, it had sort of staff expectations, our staff policies, our student expectations, extra paperwork in case you had to sort of document something. All of those things. So yeah, Andrea, so fire emergency, right? So every building where students are staying, there needs to be a risk management plan in place, or at least a sort of like two things that you could do is one is sort of do an intake form. So any housing scenario needs to have this form completed, and the form is going to ask, right? Are you like, is there an evacuation route? We prefer first floor for ease of evacuation if security is not a major concern. Is security a concern? Are there bars on the window? Do they close up after a certain time? Do they have access to an emergency 24-hour number, right? Those kinds of things. And just so that you have a higher order of sort of predictability for those areas that could derail you. So fire emergency is one that's really, really important. Do they have smoke detectors? You can actually buy portable smoke detectors that like there's one program that used to do this. They would buy them and take them to whatever program, wherever they stayed, and just put them up, just take a thumbtack, stick it in the ceiling or on the wall at a certain spot and hang it, and they'd have a little bit more protection.
Yeah, so we do something. So our main residence where they stay for 8 weeks is an 18th century chateau in France. So we have all of these historical building considerations as well too. And we have similar, you know, all the smoke detectors, fire extinguishers, all that. So, but that's great to hear. So, I mean, what I think you're saying is like, it's probably best practice, whatever field trip, whatever excursion, you know, to do the risk management, if, you know, everywhere we go. It's a good practice.
Yeah, everywhere you go, and you don't have to do it every time before you go, but everywhere
But
you
err
go.
on the side of overly cautious about
Yeah.
everything. Yeah.
Yeah. You know, I wouldn't. It's a balance. I wouldn't. You know, I wouldn't double the amount of time that you put into it, but you know, certainly not a bad idea to add to it. The majority of the time that I see these sort of submitted by organizations, and I did drop HMI's risk management document into the chat here. The majority of the time it shows up as a spreadsheet, and on that spreadsheet there's sort of one column from my perspective, left to right. There's one column that's like what's the likelihood that this will happen, another column that's sort of how severe is it if it does happen, another column that's sort of what's the, like, what could you do to prevent it, and there's a bunch of bullet points there, and then either a final column that's like, if it does happen, what are we activating, and then that might refer to another document that's your sort of the emergency sort of plan. We activate all the people and all the roles, and the trees come in and all that kind of stuff. But then that spreadsheet that's sort of spread out, you know, it might be sort of like motor vehicle accident, right, or food poisoning, or depending on where they are, Legionnaire's disease, you know, who knows. And you don't have to get so specific about Legionnaire's disease, but you might sort of say like unknown illness, you know, disease kind of thing. Like, what's the process that you go through for that? And it's going to be 3 to 15 pages, that document, depending on sort of how deep you go. Drowning. A lot of organizations say, oh, we don't include water sports in our programming, so we don't concern ourselves with drowning. Well, we don't care. In the standards, it says you have to ask about sort of swimming, because it's been my experience, students will find the water. It's still, I think, the second or third most common cause of death in study abroad is drowning risk. And it's never part of a program is to go swimming at the beach, right? Like that's not what we're doing Monday through Friday, but that's where they go. So having some just risk awareness around it. And that's both sort of training, but also, you know, other stuff too.
Great, thanks. That's really helpful.
Okay. Yeah.
I have a quick question. One, we just got an email in for our spring gap program. And one thing that we've come up against a couple times is, what do you think about 21-year-olds? Like, normally it's capping at 18 to 20. I know 21 creates the whole new dynamic that they are 21 and can legally drink. Like, what are your thoughts on that?
So Brad Gillings runs this great organization called Youth International. He's literally had students in his group that are in their 60s. It doesn't happen that often, and it takes a high degree of facilitation skills to do well, but it can work really well. If you have a 21-year-old, you know, I always tend to, I wouldn't say no sight unseen. I would certainly engage in the conversation, just sort of see if it's a decent fit, and just tell them straight out, like, hey, chances are you're going to be taking on more leadership roles. And if that's something that you want, I'd love to work with you on that. Our staff would too. People will be deferring to you. So you'll be in a different position of influence. I tend to also sort of say, like, the expectation is not that you're going to be able to drink, right? Like we have our policies and whatever the local laws are. There are some organizations that will sort of say there's on time and off time. So on time are weekdays, off time are weekends. We don't care what you do on weekends. Let's ask Doug from the law guy about that question, because that is something that has gone really wrong in a couple cases with some legal consequences. And it'd be good to get a better sort of read from him on some of the ins and outs for why that happened.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. I'm just gonna ask Doug. Off time for students. It's usually on weekends, and it's usually like in the don't ask, don't tell realm, which is usually a bad indicator, in my opinion.
Yeah, and we're definitely not that kind of a program. We just don't have that time, you know, and they're not really interacting with the public
Right.
on their own. So it is a little easier for us to manage, but it is, I would be curious to hear what he thinks.
Yeah, so we're up against the issue of, obviously we're in Europe, so over 18. So we're trying to introduce a kind of responsible alcohol consumption policy.
Okay.
We know a few European programs that do it, and actually a lot of the gap year counselors were talking us through this as well too, saying that, you know, in the European programs, that having a zero tolerance for alcohol consumption is often kind of a disaster because you have to police it so heavily. So I'm just wondering if you have any good advice for that. Our policy for going into this year is we will serve wine with dinner at the residence as part of the cultural experience of France, but that they are not allowed to bring in any outside alcohol to the residence. What they do off campus on field trips and weekends is up to them. We don't police that. Does that sound like we're hitting the right balance? I don't know what your experience is with that.
I mean, I've run programs that are completely alcohol free. I've run programs that are just don't get drunk. That last never worked. Most teenagers don't know when they're drunk. I mean,
yeah,
they you know, and to be honest, it's one of my great sort of regrets is I wish that we could have, because right now it just feels like the alcohol issue, we're just punting it educationally, right? Like, oh, that's like, we could in this tight environment where there's cultural sort of norms and high degrees of support and structure, we could educate them on responsible alcohol use, but no, we can't. We have to say, don't ask, don't do it, because none of us want to intersect with the liability. So it all depends on how much you want to enforce it. The reality is your students are drinking a lot more than you think they are. And the reality is they're getting away with it and supporting each other to do it more than you think they are. That's just inevitable.
I mean, I personally would prefer a zero program. That is my personal preference, but I just don't know how practical that is, you know, and yeah, and then it becomes, these issues of expulsion. And so
this is a great transition. So Doug's obviously our lawyer extraordinaire. He's usually wearing a crown, but I've asked him to take it off today so that people don't feel too intimidated. And Sam Daume is here. So we're going to ask that to our intrepid professionals today. Andrea, it's a good question. Let me stitch together the breakout room here. Great. All right, so they should be joining in 60 seconds. Apparently that's what Zoom wants you to do. Sam and Doug, welcome. We're just closing out the breakout rooms from before, and then we're going to get you for an hour. Thank you for the willingness to be such experts here. We have two, so there's a grand total of 8 people who have paid for the Institute. We have 4 in attendance today. That's just how it seems to be working these days. 2 program providers and 2 gap year consultants. And so we've got some questions for you, but we'll wait until the rest of the breakout room pops over here, which will just be a second. I don't want to do introductions yet, because then I'll just make you do them twice, and that's just no fun. There we go. All right. And just like that, we're a big family again. All right. Brilliant. Well, thank you all for joining. We've got so what I'd like to do is just do a quick ask Doug and Sam to do a quick intro of sort of who you are, where you are, the name of your organization, and sort of how you intersect with the gap year space at this point. Just a couple minutes. I'm going to go ahead and change your names to reflect the names of your organizations on your Zoom windows, unless you'd like to do that.
Doug, I'll follow you.
Okay. So my name is Doug Stevens. I'm an attorney at the law firm of Caplan and Earnest in Boulder, Colorado. I've been doing work with recreational providers, gap year programs, adventure travel companies, and similar type operators for probably coming up on 20 years now. I provide basically all, between me and the rest of my law firm, we provide all facets of legal needs for the gap year industry. A lot of the work that my firm does is work for educators, experiential educators, public schools, and the like. So we handle all facets of their needs, ranging from Title IX issues, employee issues, in more recent times, COVID-related issues, anything that might come up in that regard. My background is more with respect to risk management and litigation. That could range anywhere from drafting contracts, drafting liability waivers, drafting just general consultation. Hey, we had an accident, we had this situation come up, help us navigate that, defend a lawsuit for us. People are fighting over money, want a refund, things of that sort, help them navigate that. Just general consultation is a lot of what I do. And a lot of it's also proactive risk management and consultation, helping to keep folks out of trouble before things happen, so that if the inevitable accident occurs, we're as prepared as possible to deal with it. So really, all the needs of the industry.
Awesome.
So that's me.
Thanks, Doug.
Super. My name's Sam Daume, and I am with Fred C. Church Insurance in Boston, Massachusetts. And I've been in the insurance business for over 30 years now, and most of my career has been working with educational institutions, and then over the past maybe 12 years, growing into the experiential education and outdoor space, which we can talk a little bit more. But just to give you a little bit of a background about our firm, we're a fiercely private and independent insurance broker, about 165 employees, and very traditional in that we have a property and casualty division handling for-profit and not-for-profit businesses, employee benefits, and personal insurance. And those are the three main divisions. And then our education practice, which has been built out over the past 25 years, is by far our biggest practice within the property casualty group. So we've grown to have about 300 educational clients. About 175 of those are independent schools. We have charter schools, colleges, universities, and anything education related. And as I mentioned, by being in the education space, so some of the larger experiential education organizations like Outward Bound and Knowles have come in as clients, as well as some of the ones in the Conservation Corps. And so we sort of formally launched an outdoor and adventure practice 3 years ago. And that's one of the ways that we sort of ran into Ethan in our travels there. But we love colleagues that have complex risk and insurance needs. And are engaged with us and are committed to safety and risk management. Those are sort of ideal clients that we work with. I will say the one challenge we struggle with is, while we'd love to serve all, we're oftentimes not a good fit for a small organization. They need to have enough scale to be able to sort of fit with our pretty proactive model.
Thanks.
I'll pause there and go there.
Awesome. Thanks, Sam. And what Sam and Doug have also been great allies for the gap year field. If you are looking for information, referrals, or like if your organization is too small for Sam's group, then I've always found that they've been a great ally in terms of strategizing a solution that will work. And I'd say that that's probably pretty characteristic of the gap year field in general, is a solutions mindset. And I try and sort of not surround myself with anyone who's not of that ilk, which is why we ended up with both Sam and Doug here. Again, thank you both for joining. So I've got a couple questions I'm going to throw at you, partially to prime the pumps, but also there's a couple that came up today over the course of conversation that seemed like they might be sort of, like you'd be very the right people to throw these at. Inevitably, I think some of them might be sort of insurance related, but Doug would have enough experience to add to it, and vice versa, no doubt. Sam, you've been doing this work for decades long enough. You've got enough enough experience in the back to pull from. Please feel free to sort of augment each other's responses. The first one that I'll throw out with is sort of, it's just to Sam. And it's an insurance question. It's the obvious topical one, but sort of what are the core insurance products that a domestic versus an international operator ought to be considering?
Okay. So I'll just run through sort of the basic coverages that any business needs to make sure that are covered. So, if you own assets, you need property insurance. You need general liability insurance, right? Because you might get sued because of something bad happens. You being alleged to have caused bodily injury or property damage to a third party. And then if $1 million isn't enough, you need to build layers of excess coverage above that, so we can talk about how much is enough. If you drive vehicles or you rent vehicles, it's probably one of your biggest risks. So you have to have auto insurance, and the excess insurance needs to go above that. If your employees get injured in the course of their job, they need to be covered by workers' compensation. International gets a little bit more complicated. I'll come back to that. And then, directors and officers and employment practices liability is a coverage that is usually bought together. For most organizations, private organizations, it's the employment practices liability that's probably more likely to be tapped into. So that's the when you get sued for sort of financial damages, maybe wrongful termination, discrimination, sexual harassment type claims. This is a policy that's going to defend you for that and ultimately pay out. Over the past 18 months, the frequency of cyber claims has gone through the roof. So every organization, large or small, should consider the merits of buying and adding a cyber liability policy. Then you get into other ones that are maybe a little less, critical for smaller organizations, but crime and fiduciary liability, kidnap and ransom, those are all some coverages. So those are sort of whether you're domestic or foreign, you need all of those coverages. As you get into international travel, then, you want to look at partnering with a travel assist organization, or having an insurance company that has a travel assist provider embedded in their solutions, because if something bad happens, whether it's a medical emergency, a natural catastrophe or a political risk or something like that, you want to make sure that your participants can be evacuated out. And then there are other ancillary coverages. International insurance can get more complicated. Beyond just workers' comp, you might need what's called foreign voluntary workers' comp. It gets more complicated if you have U.S. employees traveling abroad temporarily, or you have someone from Brazil going to Chile. All of those nuances need to be thought through. And then, again, depending on how big your program is, you have to look at whether or not first of all, U.S. is the most litigious country in the world. So if you're taking U.S. people around the world, you have to probably buy a lot more insurance than if you're operating from a different country and not having U.S. people. So I'll pause there, but hopefully that's a whirlwind tour of sort of the basics of insurance. And then, I don't know, Doug, if I
Yeah, Doug, any contributions there?
The one thing I'd add is, in addition to making sure you have the right coverages, folks like Sam and his group could be a wonderful ally in kind of explaining what's in those policies to you and what's not in those policies. Know your endorsements, know what's excluded. And that's why it's really important when purchasing insurance to use an industry professional, not your local State Farm agent with a shingle in your hometown, but someone like Sam, Fred T. Church, that really could speak to the industry and really knows the intricacies of what's needed, what's not needed, what's typically excluded, because you may think, okay, well, we think we have, let's say sexual abuse coverage, something that certainly not a pleasant coverage, but something like that, you want to make sure that you're familiar, gee, are there any exclusions in there that could come back and bite me if something happens? And what are the best products to have? Who are the best underwriters to work with? So those are really important. I think your attorneys can help you with that as well, but I think folks like Sam are an intricate resource for that.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, no, I would wholeheartedly reaffirm all of that. I think the mistake that I've seen a lot of, especially smaller operators do, is try and bring all of their insurance needs in-house, right? I'm going to find my own insurance product and I'm going to make a bunch of calls and then I'm going to become an informed expert on this myself. And I think all of us should try and become informed experts, but we should also recognize that we will never be like an actual expert on insurance, and to get it wrong is a big deal. And so these are the two areas where if you've got a little extra money to burn, even if you don't, this is a cost of not doing it right kind of thing. And I always encourage being a little bit more proactive than you might think on these two sort of arenas in particular, insurance and law. What about, how does this change for the consultant's role? If you're a gap year consultant making placements, would the needs be different in terms of an insurance product, Sam?
So so when you say a consultant, you're placing students into the various different programs. So
sometimes it would be a program, sometimes. So let's break that down. So one side would be, yes, we're making a placement into a program. The other would be, I'm making a placement into sort of like an independent experience. I did my research for woofing. I found the woofing farm, and now I'm going to place the student on that farm.
So the first one, in theory, you hopefully would be insulated, because hopefully the liability, if something bad happens, would be with the actual person, the actual program running the program. And hopefully you couldn't get dragged in just because you recommended the program. It'd be hard pressed to think that you have a direct liability there. But if you're building a customized solution for an individual 18-year-old who needs to sort of go get their life back together, and you're developing, I mean, my daughter did woofing in Australia and New Zealand and all that sort of stuff. Yeah, I mean, you need probably the same type of insurance. You need some sort of insurance to protect you there. That's going to be a tricky one. I'll be honest, I've never tried to build that solution and execute it. That's going to be a tricky one because you don't have enough scale, I don't think, to make it easy to find an insurance company to. Again, the whole premise here and one of the reasons we struggle with smaller providers is we're trying to convince an underwriter to put up $1 million of their capital to pay out if something bad happens. And there's just a certain minimum that needs to exist there to allow them to do that. So.
Now, I know from like IEC and IECA, they have sort of an insurance product that their members can buy into. Jane, is that where you were going to go?
Yeah, and I was just thinking, because coming from that perspective, and so if I promised, okay, I might recommend programs, but I'm not gonna, set up my own, as a relatively new consultant, I'm not gonna, build a custom solution for, then could I get the insurance? It sounds like what scared you off was the wide range of experiences with a relatively small scale. But if we narrowed the range of experiences we were consulting for, would that make it easier to get insurance?
Well, I mean, to Doug's point, we can get you insurance, but it might exclude all of the things that are really, you need to be worried about, right? So you could get a general liability policy that just covers your office if anyone comes to your office and slips and falls. But an underwriter is going to they're going to ask a lot of questions. So if you're in the gap year business and sending clients all the way around the world, they're going to want to know how insulated you are from being sued if something bad happens. So again, they might want to look at the contract. It'll be a challenge, I would imagine, to place that. Again, I've never tried to do that. And to the extent that there are some associations that have a already built solution, that would be an excellent avenue to pursue.
Well, those solutions are for college counseling. So it's like errors and omissions, that kind of thing. So I was just thinking about similar kinds of things that, okay, I'm going to give you the best advice I can, but, the programs cover the things that they may screw up on,
There is, the errors and omissions sort of product that's out there, and GYA has that. I think some consultants have that. But to Doug and to Sam, sort of one of the things that I've seen some of the gap year consultants do is thread the needle on this by saying, Sort of, I'm a consultant. I'm putting opportunities in front of you that it's your choice to sign up for and execute. I'm just holding space to consult and give advice. And I think that's sort of why a lot of them have chosen the consultant nomenclature rather than counselor, to be very clear that sort of the limits of what they're actually recommending. Does that make sense? Any advice you could offer in that arena, just to make sure that they don't inadvertently step on something or into a realm that they shouldn't?
I would say are your clients, Jane, mostly the families of 18-year-olds that are looking for advice as to, well, gee, I want to go to Kenya and do A, B, and C. What can you recommend? And then you recommend certain products. So your relationship is generally with the students, not with the programs themselves.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I would strongly recommend you have, this is separate and apart from insurance, but I would imagine the insurance companies would look favorably on you having a contract that basically said, especially for the first example you set, where someone pays you X dollars and you figure out what would be the best program for them, that you're insulated, and hey, I'm not making any representations about the quality of this program, or if something happens, certainly if something happens to you during that program, you're not coming back at me, because I'm not the one running the program. I'm not the one doing anything negligently. I'm the one who's representing, who's giving you suggestions and ultimately referring you to a particular program. So you can't, I would recommend that you have something in your contract saying you can't sue me because an accident or something happens during the program in which I recommend it. I realize that's separate and apart from insurance, but it's certainly a form of insulation for you.
Right. I think that's the way we would go. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, for the programs, I mean, whenever, and Doug spends a lot of time dealing with this, but whenever they outsource an activity, right, to a third-party provider, whitewater rafting in, Costa Rica, you need to vet that from third-party provider. You need to see if they've got insurance. You try to risk transfer, right, as much of the responsibility to that third party. So the same would go here, and then you'd have insurance that would hopefully be secondary after that other party's insurance is primary. So same thing here, Jane. You would want to transfer it to other people as best you can, and then see if you can get insurance carrier to provide the all other.
Thank you.
Let's follow that thread for a moment. So you're contracting with a third party in, say, France.
Not contracting with them, right? The family is.
Oh, I was thinking from the program's perspective. Yes, Jane, thanks for that clarification. My apologies. Yeah, so from a program perspective, you're contracting with someone in France. What are you asking them? Are you asking them, do you have insurance in place? Do you add me as an additionally named insured? Does that matter if it's in France versus the US? Like how does that actually work, legally speaking, in international, environments?
I think,
Since you said the legal word, I'll let you go first, Doug.
from a legal perspective, I would say yes to all of your questions. You want to vet these companies. Well, regardless of whether they're domestic or international, as a program, anyone you're contracting with, you want to vet them very well. Now that might mean, finding out that's all fast. I mean, to use Sam's example of a rafting company in Costa Rica, you want to learn as much as you reasonably can about their accident history, about who they're hiring as raft guides, who's going to be with those students, what kind of equipment do they have, how old are they, what's their inspection protocol for the rafts, where are they operating, are they going on class 5 rapids, and they have absolutely no business being on a class 5 rapid? You want to learn that. What's their mission? What's their philosophy? Are they hiring American raft guides? Are they hiring people that just, the nephew of the owner of the company who've never been in a raft before? What are they doing to vet for, for any history of sexual misconduct? That's a key issue. That happens, especially on an overnight, but I've even heard examples of it happening on the raft itself. Okay, what are they doing to vet these folks? learn about their reputation, talk to locals, align yourself with locals, people who are down in Costa Rica, who could talk about who the good companies are, who the bad companies are. Vet them as much as you can. And if you operate enough and if it's feasible and within your budget, get down there, check out their operations. You know, do they seem legitimate? Do they have good paperwork? Do they have waivers? You know, what kind of emergency response plan do they have in place? What if there's an accident on the ground? Are they going to be on top of it and make sure that proper protocols are taken, or are they going to look to your program to do that? And you might have one person on the program who's never been in a raft guide, who's never been in a raft before, and is relying on these people as much as you are. What are they doing? You know, what are they doing to make sure that your students are going to safety? So all of these, you're transporting them in a van. A lot of rafting, most rafting experiences, you're going in a van or you're going in a bus. Yeah, every time I've been rafting, I've heard the same spiel. This is the most dangerous part of the trip, and it's true. Yeah, every now and then you hear, you know, there are accidents. They happen a couple of times a summer, but I think more than that, you have bus accidents. You have, you know, who's driving that bus? All of these things at 99% chance are not going to become an issue. If there is an accident, all of these things are going to come up. What'd you do to make sure that this company was legit? All of the things we just went through. What'd you do to vet these people? And especially to Sam's point, you know, if you're dealing with American students, you know, you could be sure, or that might have been Ethan who said that if you're dealing with American students, you could be sure that they're going to get some American personal injury attorney who's going to turn over every single stone to make sure that to try to find money and to try to have you liable. And then to the insurance piece, and Sam could speak to this more than I could, what type of insurance do they have? How does it work in Costa Rica? Is there Costa Rican insurance? You want to ideally demand that if an accident happens on their watch while they're rafting you, they're going to the headwaters there, that if there's an accident that they're on the hook. Okay, well, are you listed as an additional insured? Because you know if there's an accident, especially with an American student, they're going to sue you probably before they sue, and maybe they may not even sue the local rafting company. Okay, well, you want to be able to turn back to that Costa Rican rafting company and say, hey, hold me harmless. Well, do they have insurance? If they do, is it enforceable? How do things work in these places? And that's where someone like Sam could step in and kind of let you know what the terrain is in these other countries where you'll be operating. And then you're going to want to, if you do decide to proceed with these companies, you know, you're going to want to make sure that there's a good contract in place where it's setting forth, okay, these are, you know, we're going to have people that are certified in operating in class 4 waters at least, and they're 25 years old, and you know what all, and you're going to be in charge of the trip, not me as an American outfitter that doesn't know anything about the waters where we're going to be rafting, things of that sort. So you're going to want to make sure you have a contract in place that covers all of these things. And I'm not saying this to scare you, and I realize that, you know, we only have so much bandwidth if we're operating with 50 different vendors in 15 different countries, but these are all considerations for you to be aware of. And
just because you can sell the program in 50 different countries with 80 different vendors doesn't mean you should, right? Sometimes the smart answer should be, right, we're gonna do 8 vendors and we're gonna vet the heck out of those 8 vendors, but we're gonna sort of that's just where we have the ability to make the risk management decisions that the field was requiring. You know, just because you can doesn't mean you should, right? Sam?
That's right. I think it was interesting. A lot of our international clients actually pivoted to the U.S. to domestic programs during the pandemic, and it was interesting watching them. I mean, they had the infrastructure to think through that checklist that Doug just provided you kind of off the top of his head, but they had to do that all, you know, domestically, because some of them don't run domestic programs. So, but it is. I mean, it's a lot what Doug just walked through, but that's the real deal. That's if you're choosing to be in this business, doing that vetting with third-party providers is critical. You know, I will just say it again because that's probably what keeps me up at night the most is a van accident or bus accident, because those are catastrophic. And then I think the complexity, and Doug touched on it, but it's one thing to vet an insurance program for a provider in, Colorado and look at a U.S. certificate of insurance and understand that. It's another thing to get one in Spanish with a Spanish provider, and so that's pretty complex too. But hopefully, if you were going to partner with a provider in a different country, if they're catering to other, you want to draft off other organizations that are doing similar, and draft off the ones that are working with other U.S. based programs and providers.
Nice.
I think having people on the ground, and a lot of companies already have this, but having a local ally on the ground, whether it's one of your employees, one of your contractors, one of your, whether it's a country director or whatever the case may be, having someone locally, especially if you're venturing into a new country where you've never operated before, you're going into Fiji for the first time, New Zealand or whatever, having someone on the ground who's everything there, whether it's insurance, the culture, the expectations, how things operate, who the good vendors are, what's safe, what's not safe, where to operate. That stuff's critical.
So I've got a couple other questions that I'd love to throw out, a couple that came up over the course of today, but before I just sort of take over the air horn here, do any, Andrea, Roisin, Debbie, or Jane, do you have any questions that are sort of front of the brain for you?
I did have one. So we're going to operate in Costa Rica. So that was very helpful. And I'm going there in a month, and that's the plan. And we have someone we're working with down there. So that makes me feel a little more comfortable. But we've run programs in the US since 1993. So have things set up pretty well with insurance, but it's new to us running internationally. So figuring out evacuation, and wondering what advice you have there or any information. This is like newer to me, and our executive director deals a little more with it, but I talked with him a little bit before this, and just trying to get as much information as we can about how to move forward with that piece.
When you say evacuation, what are you referring? Like if there's an accident out in the backwoods, what do you?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if something happened, particularly I think saying with COVID, like what if a student got really, really sick, and we did need to evacuate. We are close-ish to San Jose, and there are good hospitals there, but I'm going down to check it out. We know a lot of people who work down there, but just wondering what your thoughts are.
Well, I think part of it from the COVID perspective. Go ahead, Sam.
I was going to say, specific to the evacuation assistance, I mean, there are providers that do that. That's their business. So, there's a whole host of them, but, the Cadillacs are kind of the International SOS or On-Call International, and they're those are sort of blanket type programs. And then there are more roster type programs that you could look into. So certainly, and if you do buy one of those programs, they risk management. Most of your dollars that you're paying for the service fee actually go towards helping you not have an emergency. So they have a lot of resources to help you, vet the country, the locations, the hospitals, and all of that sort of stuff. So you should explore that and look to tap into that. And then, I would say a lot of my clients either tap into a Doug, so an attorney who's expert like this, or there are other, sort of independent consultants like, a Dave Dennis and a Bill Frederick are two that come to mind, heavily experienced in international that can provide a lot of counsel on how to put your toes into the pool, so to speak.
With respect to COVID, it's obviously it's changing by the day, the week, the hour. Certainly familiarize yourself as far in advance as possible as to what's being required in Costa Rica, with respect to vaccinations, with respect to any quarantines, with respect to how things will be handled if there is a positive test. Make sure you're as informed as possible up to the minute, and that your policies completely align with what's required where you're going, and that you give as much advance notice as possible to your clients, because that's key. I think it's fine to require, especially now, to require vaccinations. And if it's being required by Costa Rica or wherever you'll be operating, all the better, given how politically charged that issue could be and the inevitability that you're going to hear from folks that might not want to be vaccinated. If you could say, well, this isn't our policy, this is Costa Rica's policy, it could help you avoid a hotly charged argument with a potential customer, which obviously you don't want to have. But keep yourself familiar with those at all times and let people know this is what will happen, this is what could happen. And if it does, these are our policies. You get, no refund, or, be transparent, have a clear policy with respect to refunds, with respect to anything having to do with COVID, so that you're prepared to deal with it and there's no confusion, no ambiguity, no argument if something does happen. And communicate, be available for questions, everything like that.
I would also just say on the evacuation assistance, if you don't have enough scale to buy a blanket program for for adventure treks, the other thing you could do is you could mandate or strongly recommend that the individuals buy their own individual policy, through Insure My Trip or other individual providers, so that you wouldn't have as much control over managing that emergency, but you'd at least know that they have resources to tap into and pay.
I would strongly, actually, I'd even go a step further with that, because I think Sam's really right there, and suggest that my strong recommendation would be to actually buy an insurance product for the students, so that there's a universal process, because you don't want to learn 15 different insurance products on the fly when it matters most. And that's sort of one of the key considerations that we have. Now, does that expose you potentially more because you are choosing the insurance product for the students? I mean, Doug, my guess is yes, that does expose you more. So it means even more of an obligation to do your research right. And if you're going to put a product in front of the student, that it really does cover sort of, and you're clear about what it does cover, not sort of it's going to cover all of your needs, because each student's needs are different, but this was the rubric we used for why we chose this product. That would be, I think probably the smartest possible way to do it. The mistake that I've oftentimes seen students do is most US students, most US citizens, adults, have no clue what their health insurance will cover them for. And so if you say, like if you ask them, does it cover you if you go to Costa Rica? Half of the students will say, yeah, sure, without ever having made a call or doing any, because of course it covers me. What are you talking about? And that's as far as it goes. So that's one of those areas where it's like sort of, they don't know what they don't know. So it's got to be on us or somebody in this pathway to educate them about sort of the questions that they need to be asking. And from GYA's perspective, if you're an accredited provider, we do require a universal evacuation policy. So that could be self-insured, that could be you buy everyone the same product, that could be you require everybody to buy this product if they, and they can get everything else that they want, but everybody has to have this core product. And the fundamental sort of rationale there is, and I used to do this, I would call them on Thanksgiving at like 2 a.m. and just be like, I'm going to run you through a drill right now. I just want to make sure that this is actually going to meet my needs, because I guarantee you, if it's going to go down, it'll go down on a Friday of like the day after Thanksgiving. That just seems like it always seems like it's going to happen that way. And run them through the rigor and find out what they do. And if you're not happy with the responses, keep going down that tree, because there are a lot of providers who do that, some version of that insurance evacuation. Many will charge you $300, $400, $500. Some will charge you $20. Be cautious. The $20 one isn't always the best one, but it might meet your needs if you're clear about what they are. Sorry for my pontificating there. Any other questions from the attendees before I get into a couple of the ones that are sort of noodling at my brain from previous conversations at the Institute? Andrea, Rasheen? No? Great. Great. Okay, so here's a bit of a pickle for both of you, and I'm kind of curious because this has changed over the years a little bit. I'm kind of curious how it's changed. Is there used to be this idea of time on program and time off program, right? So Monday through Friday, you're on program policies apply, but guess what? Friday at 5 p.m. until Monday at 8 a.m., you're on your own, you're not on the program. What scares you about that scenario from each of your backgrounds? Are there some obvious ones, Sam?
Yeah, I would say you just don't be halfway. You can't be halfway. That's the worst scenario, right? So if you're providing lists, so here are a lot of great places to go on the weekends, and here are all the fun things that you can do, and you book them hotel rooms, and you're in the middle of that, and when something bad happens, you're going to be sued, and you're going to lose that. You're going to be held responsible, because you've taken on a role there, and there's going to be an expectation that it's part of the program. So you're either all in or all out. I would say over the years, maybe this is what you're alluding to, Ethan, was for a lot of our clients, we were like, don't go there, right? You just be really clear that, your free time is your free time, and you're on your own, and we have no responsibility, and make it clear in the contracts and that you have with the families about that. But that can be complicated depending on where you are in the world and what's available. And so if that's not an option and it's not reasonable enough to like in Europe you could probably do that. If kids are in Portugal and they go to Italy for the weekend, you're probably not in the middle of that. But other places that may not be the case. So if you do get into that business of helping the kids have a fun weekend, then you pretty much need to manage it as if it was yours, and do all of the protocols that you would. I don't know, is Doug, you in sync with that, or any other thoughts?
No, I think a lot of it's case by case basis. Certainly having a contract that's clear helps. I think I agree going to Europe or something, if you're exactly like Sam's scenario, if you're laying out for people and you're being clear, okay, well, our programs are from 8 a.m. on a Monday till 5 p.m. on a Friday, and then anytime after that, you're 100% on your own, and you make that clear verbally, and your actions have to be consistent with the contract. And that goes true with anything with your contract. The contract's not just something your lawyer writes up with a bunch of legal stuff that you don't have to be familiar with. It needs to be something that governs your operations, because if you have this great contract and your operations suggest something totally different, that's a problem, and it's going to impact the enforceability of the contract. But I think it's a case by case basis. I mean, if you're operating, with retirees on a bike trip, and you're well, okay, our trips are these times here in Europe, and we get to 5 o'clock on Friday, and you go off to another country or something, and your contract's clear, you're on your own. I think you're as a program, you're in a much more advantageous position than if you're, operating in a some hut somewhere in a third world country. I shouldn't use that term anymore, but in an undeveloped country, and something happens, and there is no, they're really part of your program, then I think it's a different scenario. And part and parcel with that is, what are you doing to communicate and make clear, and to make expectations clear, and B, to ensure that your students are not in a dangerous situation when you're not on program. For instance, I've seen situations like I've even had a case in Costa Rica where, the students they're in a hotel, and it's late at night, and it's independent time, and you're dealing with college students, and the students are told, okay, well, we're in a dangerous place here. Do not leave the hotel where you're staying. And a couple of the students snuck off, and something happened, bad situation happened with a local, and the company ended up being sued because of that. So it's, these are all things to be aware of. But I think as a good catch-all, sure, have the contract, make sure you're clear, and that your actions are consistent with what the contract says in terms of from a liability perspective, but then also be aware of everything you're saying and the potential that something could happen, and try to be prepared for it.
Yeah. That is a scenario that has scared me off and on over the years for obvious reasons. And I think, Sam, you said it right out of the gate, is it's for when it's sort of you're trying to two different things rather than just be clear. Sort of this is not program time, and nothing I'm communicating is going to indicate that that's the case. As opposed to the scenario, sort of we ran through the scenario from before of the two college students in Paris who had gotten stuck in a fire and had to jump, I think, out of a third-story window. And one of them passed, the other did not, but the university had actually booked the hotel room. And so, of course, the university was sort of strictly liable in every case. And I think it's the problem is inevitably you get a young person who's feeling more brave about the world around them. They're feeling empowered, but still very clueless around the world that they're intersecting with. And that's when it's on us to train them, right? The expectation, is that they don't know what they don't know. You've heard me say this 1,000 times. They don't know what they don't know. So where do they get the information that's going to keep them safe? And that's got to come from us. If it doesn't, it's coming from natural consequences. That's just the harder route. They'll get there too, but it's unfortunately the harder route.
I mean, a lot of it really is case by case basis. Certainly, you want to make sure your staff is aligned and is on board and is well trained, because you could do everything right, but if one of those staff members said, well, off the record, I heard there's a great bar in San Jose that you can go to, and it turns out that that's in some terrible area, some terrible neighborhood, and something happens to a student, well, that's, you could have all the paperwork and do everything right, but if something like that happens, you will probably be facing exposure. So.
Next question is around end of program. So intersecting with youth, let's say sort of the classic scenario is programs finish, you have 2 students who are staying behind and your staff are staying behind. Sort of any considerations around policies for professional engagement, right? Is it, you can't require something outside of the terms of a contract for a staff person, right? If there's a date on that contract, but is it really helpful to say, sort of, be a professional or behave professionally? Like, does that actually help anyone?
You're saying in your staff contract, or what? Oh, your liability with respect to students after the trip ends?
It's two sides of it. It's the staff side and the student policy side. So it's both, actually. And I think it's equally easy to get them wrong. Probably easier on the staff policy to get that wrong, because that's what you ultimately have sort of more of a modicum of control over. But I mean, I've literally had students get drunk on an airplane. I've had a student sort of, on the airplane home lose their ticket. Now that becomes the program's problem. I've had a student rent a moto scooter on, the hours on the way to the airport because he was staying behind, and wreck it with another student as a passenger, his girlfriend at the time, on one last hurrah. That was not their last hurrah. So any advice? Like, I know that, like, for instance, that the scenario that I'm sort of hear a lot of is, Knowles and Landor at the end of a program, there's the one bar where they're all going to convene at. I've heard some organizations say we're going to build in a 2-month window. So sort of no other relationship other than a professional relationship for 2 months after the end of the program. Have either of you had that sort of come up in your careers, either as insurance or law? And if not, or if so too, just professionally in stories, like, what's some advice you could offer the attendees?
You go first.
Thanks, Anna. Well, from a contract perspective with students and with staff, particularly with students, I'd be very clear when the trip begins, when the trip ends. It begins, whatever the case may be. When we meet at JFK Airport on Friday, April 15th at noon, and it ends on this particular date, or it could be something totally different. It could be when they arrive here, when they don't, whatever you want it to be, I'd be very clear about it. so that if something happens outside of that window, you're at least contractually insulated. But I'd also, but you also want I think there's a common sense component to it as well. You also want to, I usually include language like in my waivers, look, if a student is dismissed for some reason, whether it's due to, or a student needs to go home because of, for whatever reason, that, what it says in that regard, and that the student, you're responsible for your own transportation home. And if you get dismissed, you're legally responsible, you're financially responsible for your own trip home. And if something happens, that's on you. So I'd be very careful about that, but certainly communication is key. Common sense is key. If you're in some dangerous place and all of a sudden, some 15-year-old student violated a policy and that student is now being dismissed from the program, is it reasonable, notwithstanding what it says in your contract, is it reasonable to leave that student in a dangerous part of a city because that's what your contract says? Because ultimately, if there's a negligence claim brought against you, that's going to be the standard. What would a reasonable person in the community do? Would a reasonable person take a 15-year-old student, leave them in the country at some strange place and say, you're on your own now, kid? No. So there's, you want to communicate with the family, you want to communicate with the student, you want to ideally, if at all feasibly, escort that student onto the plane and have communication, ideally in writing with the family, and let them know, what's going on. I think all of that's kind of common sense, but common sense doesn't always prevail in these scenarios.
We got stuck on a scenario like that a couple of years ago, where we had a student who was getting sent home ostensibly because the student was making unsmart, sort of unsafe decisions. He couldn't keep himself safe, and we weren't comfortable with the liability of that, so we sent the student home. Now, as we were starting to wind up the process of sending the student home, it started to look like there was going to have to be a forced overnight and at least 3 or 4 different sort of transfers of an airplane. So is it reasonably this is something that we had to ask ourselves, and ended up having a whole conversation with parents and getting written documentation to find out, right? Like, is it reasonable to say, hey, this student can't keep them safe, so yeah, we're going to send them on an international around the world trip where they're going to be responsible for themselves, navigating all these intersections, managing money, like customs, immigration. Is that defensible? Or if something goes wrong, are we on our heels? Because there's like what were you thinking? If that's the rationale to send the student home, then you have to send a staff person with them. And so there are clauses that Doug, you've worked with organizations I've had a hand in this to do as well, is to sort of add clauses in the realm of like if an evacuation requires your student to come home, you're responsible for getting them yourself. It is on you to fly out and scoop them up, or if not, then you're okay with them flying home alone, right? So then the obligation becomes on them. And that was, I mean, we went down a spiral for like a week internally of like what do we do? What's like, how do you frame this for the family? Is there an insurance product we can get? What kind of legal justification do we add? It got really complicated really fast.
I think communication is key, and a lot of it's case by case basis.
Yeah.
If you're dealing with a 15-year-old that's just completely out of control, and that's one scenario. If you're dealing with a 17-year-old who's a lot more responsible, a lot of it's case by case. What are we really talking about in terms of layovers? I think a lot of it's case by case, but a lot of it's also communication in writing with the family, and make it clear it is our extremely strong recommendation that you fly to so-and-so and get your child, and we're willing to do A, B, and C and leave a staff member behind, or some kind of, chaperone behind to accompany your student and meet you here on this date, but we strongly recommend that you do that. And if their response is, that sounds great, but we already planned our trip to Tahiti and that's where we are, and sure as heck not going to end our trip early because our student is a screw up, so let him deal with it. That becomes, and I've heard that scenario too. How do we deal with this particular situation? And it really is a case by case basis, but at the very least, you want to make sure your butt's covered and you're using common sense and you're communicating with the family, and you're even communicating with the student, and you're arriving at a consensus, and you're documenting your file, so that if something does happen, you know, it becomes what may on the surface seem like a completely unreasonable decision was actually a very well thought out decision made after consultation with the family and the student and our attorney and so people. And here we are.
I'll spin the question, Ethan, and talk about the staff exposure, the staff-student relationship exposure. And you know, I'm driving into the office today. I heard the NPR article on the Boy Scouts, and there's the settlement being voted on, and you know, it's billions of dollars. So it's an understatement to say that getting sexual misconduct insurance is a challenge these days because of these, you know, terrible things, terrible cases and situations that have happened. But you bring up a great point. There should be strong protocol policies about, you know, what the expectations are during the program with what staff and students can and can't do. And I think it is reasonable to say after the program, especially on international, that scenario that you say there, it just doesn't work. It just seems like, because when something bad happens, you are going to be in the middle of it. There would be no way to get out of that when there's a sexual assault alleged, a month and a half after, as the student and the staff were traveling around Tahiti. You know, it's just like, you own that. So you got to forbid it.
Yep. Well, I keep sort of doing my best to remind all the attendees here that when you're on a gap year program, anything experiential education, and you're in the middle of nowhere, be it sort of the outdoors or be it India, with little recourse for your own life safety, that staff person is your life baron, right? It's their job to keep you alive. And whether that's sort of factually true or perceivably true, it is true for the student. And so that power differential, it's even more exacerbated in those scenarios than it is in the teaching role, where we're talking about a grade and seeing you tomorrow rather than like my actual life. And so you have to apply that lens as a conflict of interest lens and lean into it. You know, it's not an issue until it's an issue, which means it always needs to be in the realm of an issue. Otherwise it'll bite in the butt. Questions? I have one final one, and we have about 6 minutes left. It's sort of a quick fire one, so it might not take too much time. But just sort of give me a sense for benchmarking to each one of you. Let's presume an organization of $1 million a year gross income budget. What would be a reasonable amount to set aside for a budget each year towards sort of insurance and towards legal, right? Like if I'm doing it smartly, reasonably, responsibly, like in your ideal world, like what would be a number, you know, like, well, for each of the insurance products, I know that that's going to be a different sort of percentage, you know, if it's international, depending on the type of experiences, and certainly legally as well. But just give me some sort of a benchmark, or, you know, a realm to know whether we're doing it right or wrong.
Boy, that's a really, really challenging one to estimate. Maybe Doug, you can, because you're, you know, to a certain extent, you're compensated somewhat, you know, proportionally to sort of the time and energy you invest into it. But building an insurance program is so different depending on what you're doing and where you're doing it, that it's pretty impossible to, you know, to budget. So I don't know. It's almost impossible for me to even ballpark. I can do it with an independent school, but you know, it's pretty hard to say on a gap year type program that could be anything from anywhere. So I don't know. I think I may have to punt on that one.
Okay. I'll give you a passage on that. I might reserve the opportunity to refine it later. I can tell you GYA, we have errors and omissions insurance. We have directors and officers. We have general commercial. We have workers' comp.
Yep.
Those are what we have. And that seems to, you know, for a budget, our gross budget is roughly $120,000, $130,000 a year for the Gap Year Association. We spend probably $6,000 a year on, you know, between those insurance products, 6, maybe 7.
Right. But you have a little bit of a professional exposure, so you have a professional policy, but the professional underwriter is not too worried about a major claim, I don't think. And then your bodily injury exposure is vastly different than all of your clients.
Yep.
So to the extent that someone's running programming, the example we've used, and going to Costa Rica and doing all the fun outdoor activities in Costa Rica, I mean, there's real risk there. Hopping in vans, there's real risk. I mean, so, I mean, as a start, I mean, it's at least 25 grand just to get started. It would be, the starting point. And that's if you can find, like, I'll be, like we don't really work with clients that don't spend at least $100,000 in premium, basically. So that gives you a little bit of idea of scale, because it's so challenging for a small operator for a broker to place the insurance for that $1 million provider, who needs all of those policies you listed, but wants to try to do it for 15 grand. It's hard.
Thanks, Sam.
Because we get, and then, you probably understand this, but in general, brokers get paid usually on a commission basis or a fee basis. If it's commission, the broker's commission is generally somewhere between 10% and 15% of the premium. So again, if the premium that you're paying is 15 grand, the broker's making somewhere between $1,500 and, maybe a little bit more.
Right. Which
that can get eaten up pretty quickly.
Oh yeah, and well, that doesn't cover overhead for the brokerage either, right? That's just what they're paid. Yeah. Doug, how about that same thing from a legal perspective? Is there a sort of a rough target to help with?
I would say for our typical, I represent multiple gap year programs. I would say typically it varies on the size of the operation. I just charge on an hourly basis. If you don't use me for 6 months, you don't get charged a penny for 6 months. And typically, I would say 2,500 to 5,000. I mean, some of it is getting the initial year when I'll draft a liability waiver. That's usually the first thing I'll do for folks. That'll run, I don't know, maybe about 1,000 to 1,500, depending on how intricate your operations are. But I've done enough of these that I have it pretty dialed in, and the state where you're operating, if there's something unique about them that I need to tweak it, but that's pretty typical. And then oftentimes I'll draft kind of a template contract for you to use with subcontractors, that talk about division of responsibility, when a trip starts, when a trip ends, who's responsible for what, things of that sort. That's usually more intricate, especially if there's some negotiations going back and forth. And then there's a terms and conditions agreement. Many times the clients will already have a template, and I'll just review those and tweak them and make adjustments. But a lot of those are, my goal is to obviously to limit my clients' legal expenses. So a lot of those will be kind of one-time expenses that I'll do for them initially, and then every couple of years, or if there's something that comes up, hey, I have this new relationship, can you take a stab at this contract? But oftentimes it'll just be revising, updating, which are a lot more minimal than the initial cost. And then after those initial documents are drafted, it's typically, hey, I had this labor issue come up, I had this problem with this employee come up, I had an accident, I had a claim, help me navigate that. And that's, depends obviously on the scenario. But typically it's, there are clients that I'll have an upfront, I'll do some of the initial documents and it'll be 2,500 to $5,000. And then, each year after that, it'll only be $1,000, $2,000, depending on what happens.
So I guess
some years, I won't hear from them for a year, and that's fine.
Well, I guess my encouragement to everybody, whether you're a consultant or a provider on the call, is to think about these two folks, these two fields, as an annual sort of component. So build it into the annual budget every year, a legal line item, whether you need it or not, build it in. And then that way, when the question comes up, what you don't want to do is to say, where are we going to have to pull the money from this? Do we call or don't we call? The answer is you call, but you're much less likely to do that unless you have the budget set aside. On the insurance side, it's the same thing, except it's maybe going to be less of a call and sort of a direct expense on an insurance product, and more sort of talk to them every year. Just do a check-in. What's changing? How has your program changed? enroll the insurance people as an ally in your overall sort of outlook, because there might be products, there might be writers that you can get that you don't even know about, that they'll be able to loop you into. And that's why you work with, someone who really knows their stuff. That level of detail, it's just, you're never going to get there yourself. So think about it as an annual commitment to just sort of, keep the ship afloat, make sure that it's going properly on the legal front and on the insurance front. Set aside money and set aside time every year for both. And with that, that's a great way to close. Sam, Doug, thank you very much for your time. If you wouldn't mind throwing your emails in the chat window, that'd be very helpful. Once again, these two are huge advocates and allies of the Gap Year space, the Gap Year Association. They know their stuff better than anyone in this field. And so think of them as allies should you need. Thank you, Sam. Thank you, Doug.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, you bet.
Thank you.
A pleasure. Always enjoyed chatting, and be well, everybody.
Thank you.
Be well, be safe.
Take care, you guys. Bye.
Yep.
All right, you intrepid institutors. Let's take until 10 past, so 7 minutes or so. We'll take a quick break, and I'll see you in 7 minutes, and then we'll be close to closing the day. Actually, all of a sudden it happened. there. Debbie, can I ask you a quick question? So I wanted to ask, actually this is good for Roisin too, but I hadn't planned on doing a sort of a certificate of completion for the Standards Institute, just because it's not typically something that I would imagine you'd really sort of throw on a wall somewhere and sort of use to get new business. But maybe I've been thinking about that wrong. Would a Standards Institute certificate be beneficial to you at all? Maybe professionally, maybe Roisin and Andrea, Debbie might just be good for your CV, I suppose.
Yeah, I like the idea of it. I think it's great.
Yeah, I do too.
Great. Yeah, I can do that. I've got a great one set up for the Counselors Institute. Jane's about to get hers, but I'm waiting to do it as a digital badge as well, since there's new services where you can sort of just throw it onto LinkedIn and get the extra value for it. So I'm going to wait until it's all together and I can send it to you as a digital badge as well. But
Okay.
good to know. I think it'll be good. Jane's going to walk out with a new trophy wall of GYA certificates. Oh, that's great. Okay. Well, thank you for that. So the time that I have for the rest of the day really set aside is discussion around the implementation of standards, and that can be a very complicated thing. It doesn't have to be, but that also may not be where your attention is at right now. And so rather than just sort of saying, well, the schedule's the schedule, I thought I'd check in. Is that a good use of time? Are people toast for the day? And I'm just sort of like, I need a sort of a cartoon and a beer. I mean, it is Wednesday, I suppose. So maybe that's appropriate, but where would be a good use of time? Alternatively, I could also do the storytelling of the standards, or there's a pretty well-known scenario, the Hotchkiss scenario, that everybody knows in the sort of outdoor ed gap year space, that I think is just one of those that you have to know at some point. We could tell that story as well. So Debbie's in for Hotchkiss. Jane's down for that too. Andrea, Roisin, where are you at? Is that okay? So maybe we'll start with the Hotchkiss scenario and then see where that leaves us in terms of time. Inevitably, there's going to be a good discussion that comes out of it. But this was a major lawsuit that happened about 10, maybe 15 years ago. It got adjudicated and then it got sent back to appeals, and I'm sure it still went through, just for a lesser amount. But the Hotchkiss settlement, I'm curious what it actually came in at. Hotchkiss school.
How do you spell that?
Hotchkiss. It was a $41.7 million jury verdict in Connecticut. And that's partially why it's such, it's partially why it's such a big deal, is because that's enough to put anyone out of business. I mean, it's Hotchkiss, so apparently they're doing okay with it because it's Hotchkiss and they've just got a huge endowment, but they also got a lot of insurance products. But David was, he's a friend of mine. He was one of the core guys at Hotchkiss who was going through all of this whole process. And I gotta say, it raked him over the coals, but he was able to do it with integrity and authenticity throughout the entire process. He didn't have to give up his humanity, which I don't know, that's about as big of a win as if you can get through the legal process and not do that. So here's the scenario. The Hotchkiss scenario is school field trip out to a rural part of China. There's a groomed pathway up the hill and a groomed pathway down the hill. It was a school outing. They were gone for like multiple weeks, but then this one day was a day trip to sort of this tourist site of interest. The school had done a little bit of research and found that they, you know, like fleas and ticks and sort of mosquitoes are an issue. So bring some bug spray. And they had that. As they go park the bus, and the students are all sort of leaving out, they leave the bug spray in the school bus. And the students all run up the hill and have this great sort of outdoor sort of hill cultural experience in rural China. Turns out two of the students, all of the other students go down the normal groomed pathway. Two of the students sort of go off trail, and they're sort of kicking up these really high sort of pathways and through some foliage and stuff. And turns out that I think one of them ended up getting a type of tick-borne encephalitis. And if you're familiar with encephalitis, that's sort of a swelling of sort of the cerebral spinal fluid. And so that can be deadly. It can be paralyzing. It can be a lot of different things. In this particular case, the student ended up getting paralyzed. And the lawsuit fundamentally went that the school had actually looked ahead and didn't see that there was any mention from the CDC that this particular type of tick-borne encephalitis was in China, but it was endemic. And it was endemic enough that the school had actually gone ahead and bought that sort of, tick and bug spray, but they didn't actually follow their own training enough, and they left it in the bus. And so why was it a $41.7 million lawsuit? Anybody have any thoughts on why it was so high? There's one primary reason for it, but Andrea?
Because they'd already acknowledged that they knew about the risk.
That's a part of it. That's definitely a big part of it.
Didn't follow through on their own policy.
Yep.
Like negligent, or maybe, I don't know what the legal terms are, but, or I don't know what the result is. Did someone was it a lifelong illness after that and never be able to recover?
That's it exactly. So an 18-year-old, you map out sort of what's the lifetime earnings of an 18-year-old. You talk about sort of what's it cost for a lifetime of paralysis. So lost income plus sort of added expenses. And so that's one of the common scenarios that I like to emphasize a lot when working with staff, sending them out overseas on programs, is a lot of staff that are leading these field trips, they're in their late 20s, early 30s, and there's still that sort of invincibility to them. And it happened once that I was leading a staff training. We had a bunch of students on campus coming in the following week, and when we were moving a large object, and the staff person threw her back out, moving the object. And that was the obligation of the organization to manage to get her sort of well and healed. In that case, it could have gone really bad if she had been paralyzed. And so that's the scenario I always like to talk about. There's one other very famous lawsuit that came about that's around sort of staffing and employment types. And I'll cover that in a second. But the Hotchkiss scenario is a really interesting one because they knew, they did the research, but they just missed that sort of, you've heard that, so the last mile, that scenario when you're talking about public transit or sort of social justice efforts, that last mile of actually taking the bug spray out and using it. And the irony is, if they had used it, would they still have been found at fault and sued? Probably. But a lot of times in the lawsuits, when these things actually get sort of thrown up and chalked and sort of like torn apart, they're actually looking at sort of, okay, what's the actual fault line of culpability? Is it 40-60? Is it 80-20? Is it 90-10? And then they apply a secondary financial rubric to it in that way. So it's a really interesting scenario. And so that was from this is saying 2017. No, it happened before that. I'm also seeing a Hotchkiss school sexual abuse lawsuit in 2019. Wow, they've been through a bruiser. I'm glad I'm not at Hotchkiss at the time, but a great school by any other measure. So that's the scenario. It's kind of a scary one. It has sort of roiled a lot of organizations, and especially when you look at a $41.7 million lawsuit, most of you were great. So I've got $2 million of coverage. Where's the other 39 going to come from? Well, it's not going to come from anywhere. And it's one of those hardships about running a small ship, is that you might actually end up closing down and building a new organization legally, just because that's the best path forward. If you can, I always encourage, getting larger orders of umbrella coverage, right? So one of the reasons why we're most concerned about a vehicle flip, a van incident, a breakdown, is if a van goes off a cliff, that's a really bad scenario for one student, but that van might have 15 students in it, and multiply that out, and all of a sudden it starts to look even more dangerous. Any questions about the Hotchkiss scenario? Things you would have done differently? Were you in their shoes? No.
I'm just wondering if the fact that the kids broke off from the group and, was that part of the consideration too? 'Cause that's a failure also, right?
Yeah, so I would say, yeah, so where were the staff? That's one of the first questions that a parent's going to ask is, where were the staff? And the answer doesn't have to be, well, the staff's job is to be sort of tied at the hip to the students 24/7, but you just have to have a good answer that's pretty well thought out. So yeah, there is some culpability. The students went off trail, but was there signage? Was the signage in English? Whose responsibility was it to educate the students about the signage? And then there's sort of there's different orders of liability when you're talking with about a high school student, someone who's 15, 16, than someone who's 18, 19, and that's another part of the equation here.
But it's like what you said before about multiple layers.
Right.
They failed on the putting the spray on, and then they also failed with keeping the kids on the trail.
Exactly. That I get where you're going, Jane. Yeah. From a risk management perspective, not from a sort of a who's liable perspective. Yeah. There's plenty of other things that they could have done. They could have thought about this as orienting to site and place, right? Every time that you land, theoretically, there should be some sort of orientation. Theoretically, there ought to be some sort of like I always like to suggest have a checklist, because the important stuff you won't know if you've covered unless you can tick the box, right? Is there a legal record? Did you tick the box or didn't you tick the box of covering that core topic? It used to be that I would lead programs in India and we'd have to cover flesh-eating bacteria. That was just something that was required by the legal department of the program that I was working with at the time, because there had enough close calls that we had to be able to say that we covered it during orientation. Roisin, you had a hand up?
Yeah, I think I also like the piece that you were saying of, well, I lost my train of thought. Just reminding, I think going through scenarios and reminding staff, like, that's worst case scenario, and that it doesn't happen that often until it does. And then you're really thankful when you can look back and know you've practiced those things and put it in place. And I think it's easy to do when you're doing so many things that, like driving and everything, everything has a risk, but I do think that is something in staff training just to really hone in on is, it's like everything to a T.
Totally. It's like that Fiji scenario. If you can predict a path, like an outcome that's a bad outcome, and there's something that you can do to prevent it, then that's what being a risk management sort of officer is. It's a rubric that you apply to every day. And whether it's in a car and checking to make sure that if there's seatbelts, everybody has one, that the tires are properly inflated, and the driver's not drunk. Like, literally, that's one of the transportation checklist things that we always emphasize at the GYA for providers. Just because you've hired someone to drive the car doesn't mean that they haven't been taking a stimulant or been drinking during the day. Who knows what their personal issues are? The fundamental fact is you're in charge of 12 students, 15, whatever it is. I trusted the stranger to do what was the right human thing to do is not a good answer. It's, check but verify, or God, you're going to be so tired of this, the trust in God but tired camel too. Let's see, the other scenario, it actually was an ARCC scenario. So this is an actual GYA accredited program. And partially why this came up was around trying to pay staff via exempt pathways. So if you are paying someone in the States, you either have to classify them as a 1099 contractor, which has a bunch of rules state by state, or you pay them as a salary employee, or you pay them as an hourly employee. And there's different rules around that. Once a staff person is international, they're bound by international laws. Doesn't matter where you're incorporated, they're bound by international laws. What happened was the staff people were, they'd run them through staff training domestically, and then they would pay them their full salary, I think, at the end of program. And the problem with that scenario was they were trying to classify their staff as exempt, meaning they can work more than 40 hours in a week and not have to pay time and a half. But the reality is, since they were doing their training domestically in the States, they were running afoul of labor laws. And so the staff got together and did a class action lawsuit against the company to say that you aren't paying us according to fair federal wages. And the company said, well, we operate as a summer camp because the majority of our income is made in these peaks and flows. And it actually ended up having to get litigated all the way up to judges and stuff. And so it's one of the common things that a lot of organizations really struggle with is how do you pay staff, especially if it's domestically at an hourly rate, because that ends up being a lot of money, because when is a staff really off call? Like really, like that doesn't just sort of stop because the kids are in bed. That doesn't stop because, you know, my coworker's with them now and I just happen to be sort of on an errand. I'm still doing something for work pretty much 24/7. Even when I'm sleeping, I'm probably dreaming about work because that's just the work is that dedicated. And so what ended up happening was they ended up having to pay out a pretty big sum. The insurance company, I'm sure their insurance costs went up significantly as a result of this. It all got litigated on the back of the insurance company. And now what most organizations do is they'll actually contract with a lawyer to create a legal finding, which is just, it's like a way of saying, we've done the research, I've paid someone who's an expert to do the research, so I've backstopped it. And that's how we're either classifying our employees as exempt, or we're carving out a specific way to pay them hourly when they're domestic, and then a separate rate when they're international. So what I used to do when I'd run domestic trainings is I would train the staff, pay them sort of a commensurate salary that's sort of, maybe a third of their total wage at the end of training. And that worked out to an hourly rate that met sort of federal minimum wages. And then once they're international, sort of you pay them either sort of in chunks monthly or summatively at the end of the program. And that seems to steer quite clear of the pitfalls. We still ended up hiring an attorney to get a legal finding so that we could classify them as exempt eventually. But the mistake that we made was, for years, we were like, well, the staff are friends, we know them, we, you know, we'll kind of, you know, we'll pay them well and we'll just trust that it'll all work out. Well, yeah, it's easy to make that concession the first semester, but that turned into the second semester and that turned into the third semester. And it was like, oh gosh, no, this needs to be paid for. So to my point at the end of the legal and insurance conversation, think about it as building it into an annual budget every year so that you just have it there to use. If you don't, you'll wish that you had, and you won't make the call, and that call is going to keep you up at night. I feel like today's turned into story time, which isn't a bad thing. I mean, I love a good story, but let's see. So that's the ARCC scenario. Out of curiosity, let's see. Andrea Roisin, you probably most of your staff that are leading students, are they salaried? Are they hourly?
They're not hourly, they're salary.
They're salary, but they're overseas, right?
No, they're all domestic.
Okay. So
they
you might
get
actually
a lump sum at the end.
Right on.
Of the season.
Yeah. Andrea?
Yeah, same. Yeah.
Yeah.
Lump sum at the end, salaried. Yeah.
And you might, I mean, that might still be totally fine, you know, because you do fall under one of the clear exemptions, because there are, I think, 4 or 5 FLSA, Fair Labor Standard Act exemptions that staff can and programs can avail themselves of. But let's see, the one thing that I really wanted to make sure that we got a little bit of time to talk about today on the discussion front in terms of implementing standards. We've covered a little bit about sort of outside consultants, and there's a good roster of outside consultants to support just about any layer of the work here. What we haven't talked a lot about are research, surveys, and data collection. Just in terms of how do you know you're doing what what you say you're doing? How do you work towards marginal improvement? Those kinds of things. So just to not hear me talk and have you talk a little bit, apologies. What do you currently do, or maybe the better question is, where do you feel like your data collection could benefit from some added sort of investment, and maybe where do you feel like you do data collection really well? To each of you, consultants as well, actually. Roisin?
Yeah, I think we honestly do it the best with students. We do a lot of one-on-one feedback, check-ins. We have advisory groups set up, and then we also have our mid trip feedback and end of trip feedback. So I do think keep a pretty good check on that. I think honestly, and we do the same with staff and have them give feedback to each other and then include directors in that. I think that the place that we lack is probably in the office, that other piece and getting information kind of after the fact. We do well while programs are happening. But it is still all, I think that we also collect data and feedback in a similar way, and we could probably diversify that a little bit to get more information than just how students are feeling in the moment and be able to gather other data. So
I was going to ask, what kinds of outcomes data are you gathering? Sort of, or is it mostly like well-being? Are you happy?
Well-being, programmatic. Particularly our fall program was the first time we ran, so it was there's a lot of things that we can change. So we were adapting it as it went, which was really nice to be able to do. So programmatic, how they're feeling, other things they would like to share, or ways to collect feedback, whether we need to have ways to have anonymous feedback and whatnot. And then I think we pull a lot of reports and things through CampMinder, so we gather some data that way. But I do think that could probably look into other information to gather to improve programs.
Yeah, great. Debbie, I think you were toggled off.
Yeah, I was just wondering what you mean by data collection in terms of on my end, what that would mean, because just clarify and I could try to answer.
Totally. Yeah. So I think sort of on the consultant side, the data that I would say consultants are harvesting is a lot of it's going to be on the marketing front, sort of narrowing your funnel from the 50 people to the 10 who are actually going to be clients. But the other data that I think is the stuff that I'm thinking mostly about in this arena is really like outcomes, student outcomes. Where are they growing? What do you want to tell? What story do you want to tell future clients that your facilitated, your consulting sort of work is sort of after? Because I've seen organizations do that as a pre and post. Right? Like I declare I am on these 5 things ranking this way. Post on the same 5 things, I'm declaring I hopefully rank slightly higher. Sometimes that's sort of historical context. Sometimes that's self-awareness. And something that the field, broadly speaking, is moving towards is trying to sort of unionize a couple core questions that all of us in the field ask, just because we say we want to be able to at least benchmark how the whole field is going up or down in these key areas. And those few questions have been quite elusive. They're hard to come by, as you can quite imagine. So there's that, mostly on the student outcomes. And then there's also testimonials, reviews, sort of safety reviews, midway evals, those kinds of things. And so what I'm trying to do is similar to the insurance and the legal piece is try and paint a picture that sort of evaluation isn't something that's done once per student. Ideally, it's done at multiple stages with a clear concept of what you're asking for. And this admittedly, this along with the alumni piece are the 2 areas, I'd say, 2 of the biggest areas where our field is most sort of dropped the ball. Not to say that they're not executing it somewhat, but they're executing it maybe a 10th as well as they could. There's a lot of area for growth here. And so, yeah, go ahead, Debbie.
So, well, at this moment, I'm not working with any gap year students, so it's just college counseling. But because I have, this is my 18th year as an independent counselor, and I was a school counselor 9 years before. So this is all I've known.
Wow.
But I will say that because I have 5 counselors working with me, 5 IECs, independent contractors. So I'm trying to put a lot of processes in place while this is all sort of all happening at the same time. And what I've done is I have sent over like Google surveys while they've been working with my people. to check in and to see how it's going. I also use a guided path. I don't know if you guys have any kind of like a CRM portal sort of thing that you use.
Not really, not in the same way.
It's like an electronic file system specifically for college counselors, but I don't know if there's anything on the gap year. And with that, I have my advisors do notes, very specific notes. I actually have created templates for notes and said, like, if you're in a meeting, face to face, Zoom, 1 hour, this is what we did, deliverables, what are the tasks. So like very, very detailed of like the interaction, very meaningful, that emails get sent to the parents. So I sort of have like a system in place. And then I check in. I mean, I call, I text, or I'll email some clients. Some of the more difficult ones, I may reach out and just say like, how's it going with Karen, or how's it going with Kristen? And so I'm not sure if that's what you're asking, but that's sort of that's what I do. And then as far as like the after, that's a little bit different. We don't, I stay connected a little bit with clients, just an email here or there. How's so-and-so doing at college, but not a deep dive into, after.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I would say that that's one of the key areas where a lot of consultants in particular sort of have the rubber meet the road is sort of in the follow-up after the fact. Partially that's to inform you about, what was the experience? Was it a good fit? Like I thought it would be, add to your knowledge bank and hopefully enroll that student to go out and, say how great Debbie's consulting was so that, that student can bring in more clients. Yeah, I think there's a lot of different ways. Those all sound like great sort of processes, Debbie. And it'll be interesting to see how this evolves as you start to add gap year more and more to your practice. What specific sort of data you might be after.
Yeah, I would also say that throughout the process, I feel very connected to the families. So
Yeah.
It's almost like in terms of feedback, it's almost like they become friends in a weird way, like they'll just text me at 10 o'clock at night and say like, oh, I just requested a recommendation letter, so they're very involved. And then I actually ask for testimonials. If someone says, especially if they outright say, we were so happy, we couldn't have done it without you, were amazing, thank you so much, I'll say, would you mind just, shooting me a little email that I could put on my website and I'll make you anonymous. And usually they say yes. So that's kind of how I've always worked with, I don't know who said it. I think it was Marion yesterday about like so much of the business is relationships.
Yeah.
And I'm very much aligned with that feeling too, because that's sort of how I've always operated in that way.
Yeah. Makes sense. Thanks, Debbie. Jane, Andrea?
I think some of the most useful on the gap year side, some of the most useful data is the more longitudinal data that, the research group is putting together. And I think for us, like, it would be really interesting, even, Debbie, like if you could compare, how long it takes someone to complete college when they've done a gap year first, versus just a regular.
Yeah.
But then, it's also, there's, like you mentioned, Ethan, the other day, there's a selectivity bias because the kind of people who come from the families who will hire consultants with the college process or with the gap year process, maybe will be able to complete college more quickly anyway, for a variety of reasons. So I don't know, I'm not sure what the best metrics would be, but I think that's a really good question. I appreciate you raising it.
Well, there's something that I was thinking of almost, I don't know if this is sort of in the fold, but how about the students that, let's say, complete college or do 4 or 5 years, takes 5 years, and then they flounder after that. I think what the gap year will do for those students is it sort of, it helps them have that extra year of sort of the life skills and the growing up and all of that, so that when they do go away to college, it's more meaningful. Because I think a lot of students are going away to college that don't even know why they're going or what they're doing. And then they come out and then they're they work as a busboy for 3 years before they either get go to grad school. So there's this whole thing after. So I think there's this sort of like preventative, I don't know if you see that or you resonate with that, because that's sort of what I do see. There is this, the student, I get those phone calls, oh, well, or either they want to transfer, they're lost, or they were lost in high school. And I've sort of tried to guide them a certain way, but they wanted the name brand was so much more important than, okay, well, it's not a good fit. And then it ultimately just unravels anyway. And I get those, or even a student that texted me a few weeks ago, and he's like, and I knew he wasn't really equipped. And he said, I'm having a hard time, and I think I want to come home, and I want to go to school local. And I said, did you, okay, we'll talk to your parents. And he's like, I haven't told my mom yet. And I was thinking, oh my God, you haven't even told your own mother, so that's what I see. And
I was
that's
hoping
where,
you'd tell her. Yeah.
Yeah.
so, right. Yeah. Okay. But that's where I get, it breaks my heart a little bit when that happens. So.
Yeah. Yeah. One thing Ethan said last week was everybody takes a gap year. Some people just call it freshman year.
Yeah. One of my all-time favorites.
Yeah.
I've used that with my senator's office before when we're trying to secure like Pell funding or something. And nobody disputes the value of a freshman year. Everybody's happy to uplift and pay all of that money for very few returns, because it's on the pathway. And it's like, okay, what's that pathway netting you? Not a lot right now. Yeah. The joke is oftentimes if students take a gap year, they'll just avoid their midlife crisis.
That's the other thing is, but that's a really longitudinal study.
Yeah. that data is forthcoming. Anyway, I think it's an interesting conversation, especially from the consultants to the providers, to start thinking about what data would each one of you have that would benefit the other, and how could we sort of facilitate better data sharing. So like Jane and Debbie in particular, we have a vast overrepresentation of programs on the research committee. And if that seems like something that you're quite interested in, I think adding the consultant perspective is a really valuable thing, because so one of the things that happens is those GYA accredited programs that have the students go through our accrediting, like the college credit through Portland State University, our instructors of record are actually reading student journals, like the full student journal. And from an insight perspective of what that affords sort of the student and us around the awareness and the pathways of a young person's development, it's off the charts helpful. Now, the hard part is making sure that information gets back to the program, because we can't really do that or break confidence, right? I don't want them to know which program that had the problematic student in, because they could probably track back to which student was the one that sort of we're talking about. But on sort of a large gross scale, like students are going through a lot on these programs. And I feel like there's a lot better that we could be serving them if we ask smarter questions that we just haven't gotten to yet. There's some really innovative ways to do this kind of sort of data track. I've literally seen organizations do a journal prompt and then harvest the journal writing for keywords and language to then sort of subsume a larger inference of an outcome that actually has some strong statistics sort of basis. There's a lot of really smart ways to do this kind of stuff, but at the end of the day, if we're not able to talk about what students get from it, then we're just in a transactional mind frame. And I think that ultimately gap years will always suffer if that's the case, because what we're fundamentally doing is education. And the problem with experiential education is that it's necessarily expensive. And guess what happens when price tags go up on education? My favorite saying, it kills me, is this idea of, I paid my money, now do your education thing on me. And you're like, no, it doesn't work that way. But a Western mindset is transactional. I paid a lot of money, so the obligation is on you to educate me. And it's like, no, it literally does not work that way. Even if you keep trying, it's like trying to study by osmosis, which I tried in 3rd grade and it didn't work. I'd like to say I tried it again later, but I didn't. I learned that lesson once. Okay.
It would thing if so you mentioned once that some people work with Angela Duckworth, and to do like textual analysis of the journals for words related to grit, like at the beginning and at the end, just kind of seeing if there's character development.
See, that's
something
so
like
cool.
that.
see. Okay, Jane, I'm nominating you to join the research committee. That's a great suggestion. I think it'd be great for like that we could then train our instructors of record to have that lens and sort of keep a running margin of sort of like outcomes that could be talked about more broadly. You know, we just can't betray confidence, but everything else, like there's great value there. Good. Well, any final questions in the 13 minutes that remain of our day? Just either sort of general reflections, outcomes, or sort of just general questions about the day?
Thought it was great to work with, was it Jason?
Jason.
Yeah, that was really
Jason
good.
And I did a little when we met for the hour, that was super helpful just to
Good.
just chat with him and get his perspective. So thank you so much for that. That was awesome.
Good. What did you all end up spending time talking about?
Just whatever.
Good. A lot.
No,
Good.
I think just, I don't know, Jane, what did we talk about? Just
It was wide ranging, but it was very helpful. Yeah.
Good. Yeah. Well, like I said, Jason's been at every level of this field, so he knows it better than most by far. He's a great.
yeah, just having his perspective, and just we were asking questions, he was asking us questions, and it was a good back and forth. Yeah.
Andrea, Roisin, any reflections or final questions for the day?
Yeah, it was great. A lot of information, a lot to sort of sift through, but thank you for everything.
Good.
Yeah, same. This has been incredibly helpful. Yeah, I mean, if no one has anything else, I'd be curious your thoughts on implementing standards.
Yeah, I mean, any standard in particular, or
No, I think in general, just obviously a lot of the documents you're putting it in place and staff will read it and students, so that does then become part of your culture. I think there are so many standards. I can't think of any specifically, but if you are adding in all of these little things, you know, how can you go from just adding it into ensuring that?
Right. It's like that you've seen that sort of quadrant, right? Sort of unconscious incompetence, you know, conscious incompetence, unconscious competence, or conscious incompetence, and then unconscious competence. Yeah, it's quite the pathway there. So you hit sort of the nail on the head, sort of in a way already, which is sort of making sure that the policies and the culture are aligned. And in 9 out of 10 times, you're going to add a new policy or consider adding a policy, and then you're going to forget the final lift of actually sort of stitching it into the culture. And you know as well as I, if you do it once at a training, it's going to be a blip on the radar and forgotten about. Which is why 9 out of 10 times you're going to get the best results is if you practice what you preach. If you use pedagogically, experientially, the environment of teaching to emphasize the point, right? So I think this is like, and I'm guilty of it here in these institutes, is it's easy to say, well, we have to get into the weeds, and so we're going to spend time about the weeds, and that's top down, educate you up, right? As opposed to experientially saying, like in experiential environments, you're not sort of talking about, you know, filling the cup. You're not in the weeds. You're talking about more concepts and sort of application of abstract apparatuses and sort of considerations, lenses, perspectives, oftentimes in the experiential environment. And so being willing to let go of a little bit of the in the weeds for the lens that you're actually trying to get to, that's always going to be the best approach. So thinking about that is sort of, yes, in the paperwork and the documentation, yes, that means sort of, hey, I'm highlighting the new things for you, just circling and making sure that you see them. And once, you know, every year doing the training with all of your staff to talk about that specifically, that's really, really, really important to make sure that you close that loop up at the end. And like I said, doing it experientially. See specific standards, trying to think of anything that would be like a good example. If you can bring in external sort of teaching sort of tools, right? Like if there's a book or a short video or inevitably play acting, right? That same idea, people remember 90% of what they say and 10% of what they hear. So if you can figure out a way to get them to say it, that's always going to be the best place. Scenario, if you've ever done like the Nasarima kind of thing, those are always great. And then if you can couch it in some sort of higher order data, that's always helpful. Because one of the things that I'm conscious of is in any cohort of staff, I've always had the experience that there's some who are structuralists and some who are action-oriented folks. And if you hit the action folks with structure and data, they tend to sort of understand it's important, but they don't know how to use it. That's not their training. They didn't come to this line of work to get trained on that. And vice versa. So you have to try your best to make it accessible for all ends of those spectra. And I do like I do tend to sort of think about it as sort of there's the program aspect, those who are more relational, and then there's the admin aspect, those who are sort of more logistical. And those aren't sort of, it's obviously not so clearly in two halves. There's actually 4 quadrants as I tend to think about it. And there's certainly more depending on sort of how gross you want to get, how detailed you want to get. But you have to make it accessible to all different perspectives. And that means that you might have to take it for a staff person if it's a student policy and go from concept all the way to execution and do it multiple times. And sometimes that's going to be a tabletop. Sometimes that's going to be a scenario where you're play acting. Sometimes it's just going to be sort of written journal prompt with some questions to follow up. But think again about it as experiences and lenses, perspectives that you're doing. If you stay focused in the weeds, I think you're bound to fail at it, sort of largely speaking. Jane?
Yeah, I'm wondering if the problem with training is partly, it's not just how you structure the training, but it's the idea that people, like you said, the people that sign on to do this kind of work, maybe they love adventure or whatever. They weren't looking forward to coming to this training, which a lot of it's about avoiding risk,
Mm-hmm.
And so how do you maintain that fun culture and yet still cover the things that you need to do? And, it's because, you can have an experience about how to avoid risk. But as a person going through the training, I know all we're doing is avoiding risk. We're not really having fun, So
I'm thinking of one of my favorite sort of like pre-departure messages. You've heard me say this is if you're not having fun, you're not doing it right, which is fundamentally, it's not to say that sort of everything should be fun, but it's to say that there's always a mechanism to make something fun. And sure as heck, we ought to try that, because if it sucks, let's at least try and have fun with it. And if it doesn't suck, then hey, let's just have fun with it.
I used to work in a very large organization that did, really exciting things, but they had this one training program for us that it was about outreach, something. And you'd go, oh, wow, this could be really fun and creative. But it was all about things that could go wrong. The reason they funded their training was, all these things could go wrong. We need to train people. And that was, just disappointing. So
what they found was alcohol consumption went up after the training. Liability went up. Yeah, totally. I'm depressed. Darn it. No,
but I just feel like there's a tension, that when you talk about the training and sort of the standards, I don't know. It's just interesting to think about, because you want to maintain a fun culture.
Yeah. I think in some ways you're right at the heart of experiential education when it's done well, Jane, and it is a very dynamic and natural tension that it's got to be both real, right? Like natural consequences, but at the same time, we have some content to cover. So how does it be organic and at the same time scripted, right? How do I have bullet points that also leave space for the unforeseen? Because that's oftentimes where some of the best conversations come up from. And I think you're right. It does need to be fun, but we do have details we have to cover, right? So when I'm training staff every day, one of the things I'm doing is I'm doing an outing, and we're practicing what we preach. So pre-departure, I might have them lead it without any training whatsoever, and then we get to a spot, and then we debrief, like what could have gone wrong. I'll sometimes even, and this is a little bit sort of maybe wrong of me, but it's so fun. create different personas and assign hidden personas within a cohort to exemplify either common personality types, or to sort of presage a particular conflict that I want to debrief and facilitate. There's a running joke that we used to always say, we used to cap our programs at 12. And so I used to joke, maybe we need to hire a 13th person whose job it was to break all the rules in the first day. That way we could kick them out. And then the student really knew that we were serious about the rules, and then that person could be free and have a great trip. And then we could all talk about how bad that student was internally to reinforce, right, like better behavior. Of course, that's a horrible solution, and it never happened, but it was a great sort of, thought experiment for a hot moment.
Now, those are great ideas. And I feel like as you continue to do trainings like this, that kind of content will be really useful for providers, because everybody else doesn't have that same talent that you have for making it fun. But yeah, I think those are great things. Yeah.
Thank you. Great. Well, just like that, we're at the end of our hour. This is really want to appreciate y'all for sticking with it today. Tight group, a little bit more pressure being on camera, but I really appreciate the willingness to show up literally and be seen. Please know if there's follow-up questions, feel free to reach out to me. Otherwise, I will see you at the same bright time tomorrow. I'm a little bit more focused on risk management, which will be great. The group tomorrow is going to be a pretty deep dive, and I imagine a lot of stories about why they got into it, and hopefully lessons to be learned from it. Otherwise, I'm going to upload the recording again tonight. I'll send out an updated PDF probably tonight or tomorrow. And I hope you all have a great evening. Thank you for
Thank you.
Thanks very much, everyone. Thank you, Ethan.
Bye. Thanks, Ethan.
Bye.